The self-made myth code. You believe you are self-made. You look at your achievements, your trophies, the bank account, the career, the status, and you feel the surge of pride that comes from believing you carved this path alone. You think about the sacrifices, the late nights, the risks, the moments you stood on the edge and chose to leap. And yes, you did leap. You did work hard, but step back and look closer. The road beneath your feet was not built solely by your hands. The bricks were laid by forces you could never fully control or even see. Think about this. Did you choose the century you were born in? Did you pick your parents? Did you decide to be born in a place with relative safety, infrastructure, schools, laws, and some semblance of order? No. Those things were chosen for you. A lottery ticket you didn't buy but still cashed in. Your success is not an island. It is a continent built from countless hidden contributions. Some generous, some brutal, some accidental. Trauma shaped you too. Perhaps you were driven by a need to prove yourself, to escape shame, to become worthy of love you were denied. That wound lit a fire in your chest and kept you moving when others stopped. But even that relentless drive is not entirely yours. It was seeded by circumstances you didn't create. Think about the timing. If you were born just 10 years earlier, you would have missed entire industries. If you were born 20 years later, you might have faced a completely different set of opportunities and barriers. Maybe you started a business that flourished because the technology was finally cheap enough, or the culture was finally ready. Was that timing your doing? No. It was a coincidence that looked like destiny. The myth of being self-made seduces us because it flatters our ego. It lets us believe we are the sole authors of our stories. But imagine removing every invisible contribution. The teachers who saw your potential, the roads you drove on to reach your first job, the sanitation workers who kept disease from your door, the laborers who made your tools, the strangers who invented the devices that delivered your ideas to the world. Without them, your story collapses. It's easy to dismiss these truths because they feel abstract. So let's make them real. Picture your morning routine. You wake up, you grab your phone, and you check your messages. Did you design that phone? Did you string the undersea cables that carry your data? Did you mine the metals that power your battery? No. Millions of hands did. Some of them were paid well, some exploited, some worked in factories thousands of miles away. Yet all their efforts converge in the smooth rectangle you hold in your palm, the one you take for granted. That is the hidden infrastructure of your life. That is the collective labor supporting your myth of self-sufficiency. Now, think of your mind. You believe your ideas are original, but almost every thought you have is stitched together from fragments of culture, language, and symbols that existed before you. The words you speak were invented by others. The stories you admire were crafted generations ago. Even your aspirations were shaped by narratives you absorbed unconsciously. There is no such thing as a mind that is untouched by others. When you say you're self-made, you're ignoring the library of human experience that wrote itself into your consciousness. There is another dimension you probably don't consider: luck. You may not like the word. It feels like an insult to your effort. But luck is the invisible gravity that tilts outcomes. Maybe you avoided a fatal accident by seconds. Maybe you met the right mentor because you happened to sit next to them on a flight. Maybe you were healthy enough to keep working when others were struck down by illness. Luck is not the opposite of hard work. It is the backdrop against which all effort plays out. You can prepare and strive, but you can never fully remove the randomness that decides who gets a chance and who gets left behind. Of course, this doesn't mean you contributed nothing. You did. You showed up. You risked failure. You kept going when you wanted to quit. But acknowledging the unseen hands doesn't erase your contribution. It just makes it honest. It makes it human. Because if you take credit for everything, you must also accept blame for everything. You must say that the person born into poverty who never escaped simply didn't try hard enough. That the refugee who lost their family and home simply lacked grit. That the sick child who never had a chance was somehow deficient in ambition. That is the dark side of the self-made story. It erases compassion. It denies complexity. It reduces people to a binary: winners and losers, strong and weak, worthy and unworthy. So why does this myth persist? Because it comforts us. If we believe we are self-made, we can believe we are in control. We can believe that the chaos of the world is simply an obstacle course, and that with enough determination, anyone can clear it. But the truth is messier. The truth is that you are both the protagonist and the beneficiary of 1,000 hidden gifts. And when you understand that, something shifts. You become humbler, more grateful, less quick to judge. You start to see the scaffolding that holds up every success story, including your own. If you want to honor your accomplishments, honor the invisible forces that made them possible too. Thank the mentors, the janitors, the engineers, the nurses, the coders, the farmers, the ancestors, the strangers who never knew your name but laid the groundwork for your life. Thank your younger self who survived what could have destroyed you. Thank the randomness that spared you when it could have taken you out. That is the antidote to arrogance. That is the path to genuine strength. Not strength built on denial, but strength built on awareness. Next time you hear someone say they're self-made, remember this. No one climbs alone. Every ladder has hidden rungs. Every road has hidden builders. Every triumph is a chorus, not a solo. And when you see the full orchestra behind your life, you don't become weaker. You become wiser. You become connected to something much bigger than yourself. A vast, interdependent human story, stitched together by labor, love, struggle, chance, and time itself. And that realization is far more powerful than any myth you could invent. Meritocracy, illusion grid. You are told a story from the moment you can understand language. The story goes like this. You are the architect of your destiny. If you work harder, if you study longer, if you sacrifice more than the person next to you, you will rise. You will be rewarded. You will become the shining proof that meritocracy is real. It's an appealing narrative because it flatters your sense of control. It tells you that the universe is a kind of vending machine. Insert effort, receive success. But what if that machine is rigged behind the glass? What if it dispenses privileges to some while selling the illusion of fairness to everyone else? Meritocracy sounds noble, but the reality is often tangled in invisible factors most people don't want to acknowledge. Consider the child who grows up in a home lined with books, whose parents can afford private tutors, who is exposed to richer vocabularies, more supportive networks, and a culture of expectations that frames achievement as normal. Then consider the child who grows up where the lights get turned off because the power bill wasn't paid, where the parents are exhausted or absent, where school is underfunded, and where every day is a negotiation with survival rather than enrichment. When these two children sit side by side in a classroom or compete for the same opportunity, we pretend they are starting from the same line. We pretend the race is fair, but if you look closely, you'll see one of them is already standing miles ahead. That's the illusion grid, a lattice of unspoken advantages, inherited momentum, and invisible passwords. When someone succeeds, we love to frame it as an individual triumph. We love to say, they worked harder, they were smarter, they wanted it more. But how often do we interrogate the background noise that shaped their starting position? The neighborhood where they were born, the stability of their family, the inherited confidence that whispers you belong here? These are not minor footnotes. They are structural forces that tilt the playing field so that some people are running downhill and others are crawling uphill with weights on their back. Look at hiring. Companies claim to hire the best candidate, the person who performed best in interviews, but behind closed doors, selection is often filtered by unconscious bias. Did the candidate's name feel familiar? Did their accent sound professional? Did their hobbies align with what the interviewer personally values? Did they have a mutual acquaintance to vouch for them? A connection invisible to any resume but powerful in the room? These social passwords operate like hidden keys. If you don't have them, your competence is overshadowed by your lack of cultural fit. And this isn't confined to job markets. Even in universities, admissions offices say they assess merit objectively. Test scores, essays, recommendations. But legacy admissions and donor influence create secret back doors. If your grandfather's name is etched into a building, your file lands in a different pile. If your family has the resources to fund extracurriculars or hire consultants to polish your application, you can manufacture the aura of a gifted applicant, all while the person with raw potential but no resources is told, politely, that they simply didn't measure up. We pretend that meritocracy rewards effort alone, but the truth is it rewards the performance of effort when it's packaged in the right aesthetic. The right internships, the right credentials, the right story. Even resilience, which is supposedly valued, gets sanitized. Your struggle is inspirational as long as it doesn't make the gatekeepers uncomfortable. If your hardship feels too raw, too threatening to the myth of equal opportunity, it will be quietly ignored. And then there's timing. A graduate who leaves school during an economic boom finds doors wide open. The same graduate, equally capable, who finishes during a recession, finds them slammed shut. Did their worth change overnight? No. The circumstances changed. But we rarely account for timing when we assess someone's success. We want to believe that life is a perfect merit equation. Effort multiplied by talent equals reward. But in reality, timing and randomness are variables no one can fully control. Consider the example of two entrepreneurs. One builds a product just as the market is ready to explode. Investors are eager, consumers are primed, the company flourishes. The founder becomes a case study in business schools. The other builds an equally innovative product 5 years too early. The market isn't mature, funding dries up, the company collapses. We call the first founder a genius. We call the second unlucky. But when you strip away the storytelling, you see how success and failure are often twins separated by timing and perception rather than pure merit. This is why the meritocracy illusion is so seductive and so dangerous. It tells successful people they are morally superior, that they earned everything with no hidden assists. It tells those who struggle that their lack of progress is a personal failing, that they didn't hustle hard enough, didn't visualize success enough, didn't want it enough. It blinds us to systemic imbalances because it makes the winners feel virtuous and the losers feel ashamed. If you look around, you'll see the illusion grid everywhere in who gets mentorship, who gets second chances, who gets invited to the informal gatherings where decisions are quietly made. Sometimes these advantages are tiny, almost imperceptible. A nod of approval in a meeting, a warm introduction, a teacher who believes in you, a parent who can float you rent while you build your dream. But over time, those small privileges compound into life-changing leverage. Meanwhile, the mythology of meritocracy keeps everyone compliant. If you believe you alone are responsible for your fate, you won't question the architecture that holds you down. You'll keep blaming yourself for every closed door, every missed opportunity. You'll keep running in place, convinced that one more all-nighter, one more side hustle, will finally earn you admission into a club whose members were often pre-selected before the race even began. It's not that effort doesn't matter. It does. Talent matters. Determination matters. But they are only part of the equation. To pretend otherwise is to erase the profound impact of birth circumstances, timing, social capital, and randomness. When we understand this, something shifts. We start to see that individual achievement is often built on collective scaffolding, resources, networks, safety nets. We realize that the line between deserving and undeserving is blurrier than we want to admit. And maybe, just maybe, we develop a little more humility about our own accomplishments and a little more compassion for those who are still trying to find their footing. So the next time you hear someone say they are self-made, remember the grid. Remember the invisible advantages that coiled beneath their story, and remember that no one climbs alone. Not really. The system wants you to believe in meritocracy because it needs you to keep playing. But if you look behind the curtain, you'll see it for what it is. An elaborate performance, staged to make you feel like you've earned your place, or failed to earn it, when in reality the script was written long before you ever stepped onto the stage. Authenticity is currency. You were told that authenticity would set you free, that if you could just be yourself, unfiltered, raw, and true, the world would reward you. That was the promise, wasn't it? Be yourself, and you will be loved. Be yourself, and you will be seen. But the moment you realized that being yourself could also be profitable, everything changed. Because when authenticity becomes currency, it stops being pure, it mutates into something transactional. Something that looks like honesty, but feels like performance. And you can sense it in the way influencers speak to the camera, with their perfectly timed sighs, their tearful admissions, their vulnerability curated to trigger engagement. Their rawness is framed by good lighting, their heartbreak punctuated by affiliate links, their confessions designed to go viral. And you might think, surely they mean it, surely they feel what they say, and maybe they do. But feeling something doesn't mean you're not performing it. Think about how the phrase "be yourself" is now a marketing slogan. Every brand from soap to software wraps itself in that language. They tell you that you're unique, that your quirks are assets, that your struggles are noble. But behind that message is a quiet calculation. The more you believe in your singularity, the more you will spend to express it. Authenticity sells, but it also demands a cost. Because when you start to measure your worth in likes, followers, and revenue, you begin to wonder whether you're allowed to evolve. If your audience loves you for your rawness, what happens when you heal? If they admire your struggle, what happens when you succeed? If you build a brand around your truth, what happens when your truth changes? This is the hidden trap of monetized authenticity. It's sticky. It's seductive. And it's almost impossible to escape without losing something you've come to depend on. Consider the influencer who built a platform by talking about their depression. At first, it was cathartic, a way to feel less alone, a way to reach people who felt invisible. But over time, the algorithm learned that their sadness was profitable. Posts about improvement received less engagement. Posts about despair spread faster. And so, they learned to highlight the darkness, to dwell in it, to center it, because their audience expected it. Their sponsors expected it. Their livelihood depended on it. And in that moment, the line between honesty and performance dissolved. It wasn't that they were lying, it was that their identity had become a commodity. Their suffering was now content. Their selfhood was packaged, branded, and monetized. And it's not just influencers, it's you too. Every time you post something personal, you feel that rush of validation. Every time you share a raw thought, you watch the metrics climb. And slowly you start to optimize. You edit your life into digestible moments. You select which parts of yourself to showcase. You decide which parts to exaggerate. And eventually, you realize you're no longer sure where the real you ends and the performative you begins. The philosopher Jean Baudrillard once argued that in a media-saturated world, reality itself becomes hyper-real, a simulation of authenticity that feels more convincing than the real thing. You are living proof of that idea. You are a simulation of yourself, a version optimized for attention, a persona designed to be both relatable and aspirational. You might still feel like you're being real, but the reality you're expressing has been flattened into content. And content is never neutral. Even the language we use to describe ourselves is infected with marketing logic. We talk about building a personal brand. We talk about growing an audience. We talk about authenticity as a value proposition. But nobody wants to admit that when you monetize your identity, you are incentivized to freeze it in place. Because evolution is risky. Change is unpredictable. And the algorithm punishes unpredictability. If you heal, you might lose the people who needed your brokenness. If you grow, you might alienate the people who loved your struggle. And so, you learn to stay the same, to keep performing the version of yourself that sells best. This is why authenticity as currency is so dangerous. It turns your life into a series of strategic disclosures. It rewards your willingness to mine your trauma for engagement. It asks you to weaponize your truth against your own well-being. And it does so under the pretense of empowerment, because the ultimate trick of this system is that it flatters you into thinking you're in control, that you're choosing to share, that you're building something meaningful. But in reality, you're caught in a loop that exploits your need to be seen, your fear of irrelevance, your hunger for connection. And yet, you keep going, because the alternative feels worse. If you stop performing, you disappear. If you stop sharing, you lose your audience. And if you lose your audience, you lose the affirmation you've learned to crave. So you keep selling your authenticity, even when it starts to feel hollow, even when you suspect that you're just a puppet for forces you don't fully understand. You wonder whether there is a way out, whether you can reclaim your identity from the machinery of monetization, whether you can be real without needing an audience to validate it. But the truth is, once authenticity becomes a product, it's almost impossible to disentangle from performance. You can't uncommodify your soul after you've sold pieces of it. You can't reclaim your rawness after it's been packaged and consumed. You can only try to remember why you started sharing in the first place. To remind yourself that there is a version of you that doesn't need to be profitable, a version that doesn't care about reach or resonance or ROI, a version that exists quietly, in private moments, away from the metrics. That version is still real, even if no one claps for it, even if it never goes viral. Because maybe that's the final irony. that the truest form of authenticity is the one you never show, the one you protect from the marketplace, the one you keep sacred. Because when everything can be content, nothing feels true. So guard your unshared self. Protect the parts of you that remain unseen. And remember that your worth is not measured in engagement. Your value is not a function of visibility. You are more than the story you sell, more than the performance you perfect. You are a human being. And that is the only authenticity that cannot be monetized. Biology equals destiny. Lie. You've been told a story. It starts before you were born, in the quiet hum of a laboratory where your DNA sat in its fragile spiral, so small you could hold billions of it on a fingertip. This story insists that within those delicate strands, every contour of your life was pre-written. It whispers that your potential, your failures, your impulses and longings, even your value, all came encoded in that invisible script. This is the mythology of genetic determinism, the belief that biology equals destiny, that your chromosomes and their sequences are the architects of your entire existence. And for decades, this idea has been dressed up in the language of certainty, repeated so often it almost feels like truth. But pause for a moment and you'll feel the cracks in that narrative widening. Because in reality, genetic determinism is often a shortcut, an elegant way to avoid grappling with the exhausting, inconvenient, messy complexity of human choice, culture, environment, trauma, and randomness. It's a story that lets people in power shrug off responsibility. If your DNA made you who you are, then why should anyone invest in social programs or education or mental health support? Why bother improving the world if every outcome is already woven into your code? It's easier, cleaner, to blame your double helix for your depression or addiction or poverty. To say your blueprint failed you instead of admitting that sometimes systems fail people first. Consider how this belief seeps into everyday life. When a child struggles with learning, we search for genetic explanations. Maybe they inherited a disorder or a deficiency. We rarely look first at overcrowded classrooms, underpaid teachers, or families stretched too thin to nurture curiosity. When someone develops heart disease, we often say it's in their genes, ignoring the processed foods that saturate their neighborhood, the chronic stress of low-wage work, the pollutants in the air they breathe. DNA becomes a convenient scapegoat, and in that blame, we erase context and humanity. Take the example of intelligence. For years, psychologists and geneticists tried to quantify intelligence as if it were a static, inheritable trait, a neat IQ number etched into your chromosomes. But every serious study has shown the same unsettling conclusion. Intelligence is shaped by an intricate dance between genes and experience. Yes, there are heritable components, but they are not prophecies. A child with average genetic potential for cognitive skills can thrive in a rich, stimulating environment. And a child with supposedly gifted genes can wither in neglect. The genome does not unilaterally dictate a mind's destiny, or think about addiction. Genetic factors can indeed increase susceptibility to substance abuse, but genes alone do not light the match. Trauma, social isolation, poverty, and despair often strike the spark. Entire industries have capitalized on the narrative that addiction is genetic fate, a way to sell medication or insurance coverage without grappling with why so many people feel compelled to numb themselves in the first place. The truth is far more uncomfortable. We create environments that breed despair, then pretend biology is to blame when people succumb to it. And then there's behavior. In recent years, headlines have trumpeted discoveries of aggression genes or violence genes, as if a single mutation could transform an infant into a predator. But when researchers dig deeper, the picture dissolves into complexity. Most behaviors emerge from a web of influences. Biology, yes, but also learned patterns, cultural scripts, economic pressures. To reduce a life to molecules is to ignore the millions of moments that shape it, the stories we inherit, the choices we make, the kindnesses and cruelties that leave marks deeper than any gene. This doesn't mean genetics are irrelevant. Your genome contains instructions that matter. Predispositions toward disease, tendencies toward certain temperaments, variations that can influence metabolism or resilience. But those instructions are not a finished painting. They are the outlines. The canvas is filled by what happens next, how you are raised, what you encounter, who you love, and how you adapt. To pretend otherwise is to strip life of its dynamic force. Why does this myth of genetic destiny persist? Because it flatters our longing for simple answers. It gives us a villain, DNA, and absolves us of the burden to look deeper. It allows governments to rationalize inequality, corporations to market solutions, and individuals to surrender to fatalism. If your genes decide everything, then you don't have to try, and neither does anyone else. No one has to fix broken systems, confront prejudice, or imagine a fairer world. But look closer, and you'll see countless stories that contradict this determinism. Children born into poverty who grow up to build lives of purpose and impact. People with genetic risks for disease who thrive through careful choices and community support. Individuals told they were doomed to addiction or violence who forged different paths. These stories reveal the lie hidden behind genetic fatalism, the lie that biology is the sole author of destiny. Even in the world of medicine, where genetics can reveal critical information, it's clear that prediction is never absolute. You can inherit BRCA mutations that raise cancer risk, but lifestyle, screening, and luck still play enormous roles. You can carry genes linked to depression and never experience it. You can have no genetic predisposition to diabetes and still develop it under the right or wrong circumstances. The relationship between your DNA and your life is not a straight line. It's a web of probabilities, tangled with choice and chance. Consider also how this idea becomes a tool of control. When institutions insist your biology defines you, they shape the policies that govern your life. Insurance companies use genetic information to set rates or deny coverage. Employers quietly screen for traits that might predict health costs or productivity. Governments justify inaction by claiming disparities are natural outcomes of genetic difference. This isn't science. It's a distortion of science, wielded to maintain power structures. So the next time you hear that your genes are destiny, pause. Remember that the story is always more complicated. You are not just your genome. You are the sum of every experience, every relationship, every decision that followed the moment your cells began dividing. You are a dynamic system, not a static script. And perhaps most importantly, you are free to question the narrative itself. When someone tells you that your biology defines your worth, ask them who benefits from that belief. Ask them why they are so invested in erasing the power of culture, environment, and human agency. Because in that erasure lies a dangerous convenience, a way to wash hands of responsibility, to label entire groups as destined for failure or success. You deserve better than that. You deserve a story that acknowledges your complexity, a story that honors the interplay between your biology and your humanity, a story that refuses to reduce you to a sequence of letters in a genetic code. Your DNA may offer a starting point, but it is not your final chapter. And the sooner we let go of the fantasy that it is, the sooner we can start building a world that respects every individual's potential, not as a genetic inevitability, but as a testament to the astonishing power of choice. Common sense gatekeeper. Have you ever paused to ask yourself what exactly common sense is? We throw this phrase around like it's the ultimate authority, the final verdict, the compass that never fails. If something aligns with common sense, it must be correct. If it doesn't, it must be nonsense. But common sense isn't some universal law etched into the fabric of reality. It's a social inheritance, a collection of assumptions and shortcuts passed from mind to mind, generation to generation, often without scrutiny. Common sense is less about truth and more about survival. Survival of ideas that are convenient, comfortable, and rarely challenged. Think about how many things we believe simply because everyone around us does. Take the idea that working yourself to exhaustion is noble, or that money equates to personal worth, or that questioning traditions makes you ungrateful or disloyal. These ideas didn't arrive in your head because you conducted an exhaustive analysis. They arrived because they were repeated so often, they acquired an aura of inevitability. If your parents, your teachers, and your friends all say the same thing, it feels like reality. But consensus is not proof. Consensus is merely agreement, and agreement can be born out of fear just as easily as insight. Consider the cultural rituals we follow without a second thought. In some societies, it's common sense that you must sacrifice your happiness for the family. In others, it's common sense that your individuality should eclipse every collective responsibility. These opposing worldviews are both considered self-evident truths in their respective contexts. That alone should make us suspicious. If common sense can completely reverse itself across a border or a generation, it isn't some unshakable pillar of wisdom. It's more like a costume we wear so we don't stand out. And standing out is terrifying, because to reject common sense is to risk being labeled irrational, disrespectful, or even dangerous. Ask yourself why common sense is defended so aggressively. Why do people react with hostility when you question what everyone just knows? Because common sense functions as a gatekeeper. It keeps the collective identity intact. When you challenge it, you threaten the fragile illusion that our shared assumptions are natural and eternal. This is why revolutions, whether intellectual or political, are always preceded by ridicule. The first person to say, "This doesn't make sense," is called a fool. The second is called a traitor. But eventually, when enough people stop pretending, the absurdity of the old consensus is exposed. History is full of examples: flat earth dogma, divine right monarchies, racial hierarchies. At the time, each of these was common sense. No one thought to question them, because questioning them felt like stepping off a cliff into chaos. Even now, you are carrying beliefs you mistake for self-evident truths. Maybe you assume that success follows hard work in a predictable line. Maybe you believe love should feel effortless if it's real. Maybe you think some lives are inherently worth more than others. These are not universal truths. They're stories your culture has repeated until you stopped hearing them as stories. They became background noise, just the way things are. And the danger of common sense is precisely this invisibility. You don't see it operating in your thoughts. You just feel that whatever contradicts it must be absurd. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine you woke up tomorrow in a society that had inverted your norms. In this place, it's common sense that leisure is more valuable than productivity, that children teach adults, not the other way around. That wealth accumulation is shameful, and generosity is the only valid measure of success. You'd probably feel disoriented, even offended. Your reflex would be to defend what you've always known. But that reflex doesn't prove your old worldview is correct. It just proves that the human mind clings to familiarity, even if that familiarity is a prison. If you want to live consciously, you must learn to see common sense as a suspect witness. It tells you what most people believe, not necessarily what's true. When you feel the reflex to dismiss an idea because it doesn't make sense, pause. Ask yourself whose sense you're defending. Who benefits from you staying inside the old assumptions? Who loses when you begin to question? The more you follow that trail, the more you discover how much of your thinking is inherited rather than chosen. Even the language we use to label ideas as common sense is loaded with judgment. We say, "It's just obvious," or "Everyone knows that," as if those statements end the conversation. But often, they are the beginning of it. Because when you dig into why something seems obvious, you find fear. Fear that if we let go of the familiar, we will be swallowed by uncertainty. That if we stop agreeing on the old rules, we'll lose our place in the tribe. This is why common sense is so powerful. It's not just about ideas. It's about belonging. To question it is to risk exile, even if only a psychological one. Take the example of Galileo, who dared to suggest that Earth revolves around the sun. His proposition violated the common sense of his time. It seemed laughable, heretical, an insult to every authority that had proclaimed the opposite. He was persecuted not because he was illogical, but because he was inconvenient. His evidence threatened the consensus that kept the church's power intact. Over time, what was once considered madness became the new common sense. But notice the pattern. Every advance in understanding begins as an attack on what people thought was obvious. Ask yourself, what ideas today will seem laughable to future generations? What consensus do we defend now, simply because it feels safer than admitting we might be wrong? Maybe it's our approach to education. Maybe it's our assumptions about mental health. Maybe it's the stories we tell ourselves about progress and civilization. Whatever it is, you can be sure that some of what we call common sense today will be tomorrow's embarrassing superstition. So the next time someone tells you, "That's just common sense," don't surrender your curiosity. Don't assume they're right simply because they sound confident. Common sense is a costume for our collective anxieties. It's a camouflage for inherited biases, outdated fears, and unexamined beliefs. If you want to be free, you have to peel back that disguise. You have to ask, over and over, what if this isn't true? What if I'm only repeating what I've been taught to repeat? Freedom of thought begins where common sense ends. It begins the moment you realize that consensus is not the same as wisdom, and that the loudest voices are often just the most afraid of change. It begins when you have the courage to stand in that lonely place outside the gates and see for yourself what's real. Because sometimes, the only thing standing between you and the truth is the conviction that you already know it. And that conviction has a name: common sense. But it isn't your guide, it's your gatekeeper. And you don't have to keep obeying it. Success narrative syndrome. You're sold a story. You hear it in classrooms, in graduation speeches, in corporate training videos. You see it on movie screens and read it in biographies that line airport bookstores. The story goes like this: if you work hard enough, if you endure long enough, if you sacrifice more than everyone else, you will win. You will rise. You will be respected, envied, fulfilled. This is the success narrative, and almost everyone is infected by it, whether they admit it or not. You wake up every morning and you feel its tug, the promise that today's grind is part of a noble arc, that every small humiliation, every sleepless night, every unpaid hour is an investment in a victory waiting just beyond the horizon. This belief is not just optimism, it's almost a religious faith, because the alternative, that life is chaotic and indifferent to effort, is too terrifying to sit with. So you cling to the narrative. You repeat its slogans: no pain, no gain, winners never quit, hustle harder, but pause. Ask yourself, where did this story come from? Who benefits from you believing it? The truth is, this arc isn't a law of nature. It's a cultural script, handed down through generations and polished by industries that profit from your devotion. The media sells it because it sells hope. Companies sell it because it keeps you working past exhaustion. Governments sell it because it keeps you obedient, convinced that the system is fair, that your sacrifices will be rewarded if you just persist. This isn't to say that work is meaningless. Hard work can transform lives. But the idea that suffering automatically entitles you to success, that is the lie. Look around. You'll find thousands of examples of people who worked themselves to the bone and never saw the payoff. Single mothers holding down 3 jobs just to stay afloat. Caregivers sacrificing everything to keep loved ones alive. Artists who spent decades honing their craft only to die in obscurity. Do you think they failed because they didn't suffer enough? Because they didn't want it badly enough? Or is it possible that life doesn't operate by narrative logic? That there is no universal law ensuring your pain will turn into triumph? This is what success narrative syndrome does to you. It blinds you to complexity. It makes you ashamed of any result that doesn't look like a fairy tale ending. You start to measure your worth by how well your story matches the script. And if your story refuses to fit, if the ending is messy or unfinished or unfair, you blame yourself. Think of all the small, quiet ways this belief corrodes your mind. The late nights where you push yourself past your limits because you think one more hour will unlock the breakthrough. The toxic relationships you tolerate because you believe struggle is a sign of virtue. The guilt that eats at you when you rest, because rest doesn't feel like part of the plot. In the success narrative, there are no intermissions, only relentless forward motion. And yet, even when you see the harm, you can't help craving the story, because it gives your suffering a purpose. It transforms pain into a currency you imagine will be redeemed later. It lets you endure things that would otherwise feel intolerable. If you believe the arc is inevitable, you don't have to face the randomness, the indifference, the possibility that you might give everything you have and still fall short. This is why so many people never question it, because questioning it feels like inviting despair. But there is a way to step outside the script without surrendering to nihilism. It starts with this simple truth. Effort matters, but it doesn't guarantee anything. It increases your odds, but it does not obligate the universe to reward you. Once you see that clearly, you can start to free yourself. You can work hard because you love the work, not because you are bargaining with fate. You can take risks because they matter to you intrinsically, not because you expect them to resolve into a Hollywood ending. You can rest without shame, because rest isn't weakness, it's survival. Consider how different your life might feel if you measured it by moments of meaning instead of milestones. What if the late-night conversation with your best friend was more important than the promotion? What if the act of creating mattered more than whether it went viral? What if taking care of your mental health was as valuable as crossing some imaginary finish line? The success narrative will whisper that these ideas are excuses. that only losers talk about meaning instead of winning. But ask yourself, who decided that? Who benefits from you measuring your worth by productivity and public approval? If you look closely, you'll see that this narrative keeps you running on a treadmill that never stops. No matter how fast you run, there is always another milestone, another benchmark, another proof of your value. And when you finally collapse, it will tell you that you simply didn't run hard enough. This is the most dangerous part of the story. It makes you complicit in your own exploitation. It convinces you to sacrifice your health, your relationships, your sanity, because you believe that sacrifice is the price of success. You forget that success is not a universal currency. It's a shifting target, defined by forces you don't control. When you let go of the script, you don't become lazy or directionless. You become honest. You start to see that life is not a story, it's a landscape. Some of it you can shape, much of it you cannot. Some seasons will reward your efforts, others will punish you for reasons that have nothing to do with merit. That doesn't make your actions meaningless, it makes them precious, because their value doesn't come from an imagined ending. It comes from the integrity of the choice itself. You are allowed to want success, you are allowed to strive, but you are also allowed to define your own terms, to walk away from expectations that were never yours, to question whether the suffering you're told to embrace is necessary or just inherited. And maybe, when enough of us let go of this collective trance, we can create a culture that measures people by their humanity, not their adherence to a script. A culture that honors effort without demanding that it always transform into victory. A culture where you don't have to pretend your life is a perfect narrative arc to be worthy of respect. So, next time you hear that old familiar story, the one that says suffering guarantees triumph, pause, breathe. Ask yourself whether it's true or just a bedtime story for adults, designed to keep you grinding, compliant, and afraid to rest. Then remember, you are not a character in someone else's plot. You are a person. You don't need permission to step off the stage and write your own ending. Personality test identity. You take the test on a quiet afternoon. You answer the questions honestly, or at least you think you do. You choose between statements that feel almost interchangeable, but you sense that each answer is drawing a contour around something hidden, something essential. And then the result arrives. 4 letters, or a single number, or a color-coded description that seems to glow with familiarity. You feel seen. You feel explained. For a moment, you feel less alone inside your own mind. This is the seduction of personality tests. They promise clarity in a life that often feels chaotic. They offer categories, tidy labels that condense your complexity into something you can hold in your hand. You tell yourself you are an INFJ, or a Type 5, or a Social 9, and this becomes an anchor. Whenever you feel lost, you return to that description like a compass. You quote the passages that resonate, the lines that say you are introspective or analytical or prone to melancholy. And you believe you have discovered the blueprint of your soul. But here is the uncomfortable truth. These systems are not windows into your total being. They are mirrors reflecting your current ego state, a snapshot of who you think you are today, filtered through your self-concept and your unconscious biases. If you look closely, you will see that the test doesn't uncover your nature. It captures your habits. It measures the grooves you've worn into your personality through years of repetition. It names the roles you play, the patterns you have rehearsed so many times that you mistake them for essence. Imagine a child who learned to be quiet because loudness attracted punishment. Imagine an adolescent who cultivated intellect because emotions felt dangerous. Imagine an adult who perfected charm because they feared abandonment. All of these adaptations become part of your profile, but they are not the whole of you. They are strategies, they are defenses, they are the masks you constructed to feel safe, accepted, and significant. When you take a personality test, you are often describing the mask more than the face beneath it. It is comforting to say, I am an INTJ. That's why I can't stand small talk. It feels like permission to stay in your familiar grooves. You can excuse the walls you build around your heart by pointing to your type. You can justify your fears by calling them temperament. But what if you are more than that? What if your so-called type is just the story you tell yourself to avoid the raw, unsettling truth that you can change? Consider how many times you have surprised yourself. Think of the moments when you behaved out of character, when you spoke up in a crowd, though you thought you were shy, when you forgave, though you believed yourself incapable of surrender, when you tried something new, though you were sure you would fail. These moments are cracks in the mirror. They reveal that your personality is not fixed. It is more like a set of costumes hanging in a closet. You favor some, you ignore others, but none of them are fused to your skin. Psychologists have a term for this: state-dependent behavior. Under different conditions, stress, safety, novelty, different traits emerge. Your personality flexes and adapts. Yet, when you read your MBTI profile, you forget this fluidity. You start to interpret your entire life through the lens of those 4 letters. You curate evidence that supports the narrative. You dismiss the parts of yourself that don't fit. This is why personality tests can be comforting but also limiting. They give you a mirror and you mistake it for a prison. Imagine if you believed your reflection was the only possible version of you. You would never learn to dance if your type said you were uncoordinated. You would never try leadership if your type said you were introverted. You would never allow yourself to grow beyond the edges of the description. And this is the real tragedy of mistaking typology for truth. It becomes a prophecy that fulfills itself. You shrink to fit the outline. You defend the outline as your authentic self. You forget that you are the one who can redraw it. Personality tests have value. They can illuminate blind spots, highlight tendencies, offer language for experiences you could never articulate. They can foster understanding between people, but they are not sacred texts. They are tools. And like any tool, their usefulness depends on how you wield them. When you approach them with curiosity, they can expand your self-awareness. But when you clutch them like dogma, they can shrink your sense of possibility. Think of the Enneagram. It describes 9 types, each with its core fear and desire. It can be a profound system for introspection. But it is still a map, not the territory. You are not a type. You are the consciousness that experiences all types. You are the witness who can notice when you are operating from fear or compulsion. You are the awareness that can choose a different response. This is why every tradition that uses typology also teaches transcendence. You begin by identifying your patterns, but the real work is learning to loosen their grip. When you say, "I am a type 4, I am doomed to envy," you have already surrendered to the script. But what if you are a person who sometimes feels envy, and who can also feel gratitude and contentment, joy? What if your identity is not a single story, but an evolving symphony of possibilities? The next time you feel the urge to declare your type as your truth, pause. Ask yourself, who is the I that claims this identity? Who is the observer who can notice the pattern, describe it, and yet remain separate from it? That observer is your deeper self. That is the part of you no test can measure, because ultimately, no set of questions, no algorithm, no matrix of adjectives can fully capture your mystery. You are too alive, too fluid, too unfinished to be reduced to a profile. You are a work in progress, a consciousness in motion. The mirror can show you your current reflection, but it cannot dictate your future shape. So, use the mirror wisely. Let it show you the patterns you have practiced. Let it reveal the masks you wear, but never confuse the reflection for the whole of who you are. You are not your type. You are the one who is aware of type. You are the freedom to change, the courage to evolve, and the vastness no label can ever contain. Morality checklist syndrome. You probably don't realize it, but every day you're filling out a mental checklist of what it means to be good. You wake up and immediately start ticking boxes. Be polite. Follow the rules. Don't offend anyone. Hold the door open. Recycle the cup. Use the right words. Show up on time. These acts feel like evidence of your moral character, but they're often just rituals. They're habits masquerading as ethics. Because when you reduce morality to a list of tasks, you're no longer asking why those tasks matter. You're only asking whether you completed them. That's the essence of morality checklist syndrome. The idea that as long as you can check enough boxes, you don't have to wrestle with the deeper questions of what's right or wrong. Imagine a person who never lies, never steals, never raises their voice, and never breaks a rule. From the outside, they look perfectly moral, but if you could see their motivations, you'd find something hollow. They don't refrain from lying because they care about truth. They refrain because lying breaks the rules. They don't avoid stealing because they respect property. They avoid it because stealing is on the bad list. Their behavior is driven by fear of punishment or fear of social disapproval, not by any genuine conviction. This is why habit isn't always right. When you're ruled by the checklist, you outsource your conscience to external standards. You stop thinking for yourself. and you start treating morality like a compliance form. Just fill in the right blanks and you're good. Think about the employee who follows every company policy, but never questions whether those policies are fair, or the citizen who obeys every law without considering whether the law is just, or the parent who enforces every rule in the house, but doesn't reflect on whether the rule teaches compassion or just enforces obedience. This is how societies end up committing atrocities, because people believe that obeying the checklist absolves them of moral responsibility. History is full of examples. Soldiers who said they were just following orders, bureaucrats who stamped documents they knew would destroy lives, neighbors who reported each other to authorities because it was required. They all did what they were told. They all completed their checklists, and they all believed that was enough. But morality isn't a list of behaviors. It's the capacity to question your own behavior, to ask, does this action align with my deepest values? To reflect, would I still do this if nobody was watching? When you surrender that reflection, you become a puppet of convention. You think you're good because you never break the rules. But sometimes goodness requires breaking them. Sometimes doing the right thing means defying the checklist. Rescuing someone in danger when the policy says, stay put. Speaking truth when silence is safer. Challenging a tradition that harms people. Morality is alive. It evolves with understanding and context. A checklist is dead. It can't grow. It can't adapt. It can't feel. When you rely on it, your conscience atrophies. You lose the capacity to empathize and the courage to dissent. Consider the difference between habit and principle. A habit is automatic. You don't think about brushing your teeth or locking your door. It's muscle memory. But principle requires deliberation. It demands that you ask why you do something and whether you'd still do it if the rules change tomorrow. Would you still treat people with respect if there was no social reward? Would you still speak up if it cost you something? Would you still help a stranger if nobody would ever know? These questions make you uncomfortable, and that's the point. True morality is uncomfortable. It requires you to be vulnerable and honest about your motivations. The modern world encourages morality checklist syndrome because it loves predictability. Companies want employees who comply, not who question. Governments want citizens who obey, not who challenge. Algorithms want users who follow scripts, not who think critically. And so, you're rewarded for showing up with the right gestures, the right phrases, the right posture. You're praised for fitting in. But fitting in is not the same as being good. Sometimes, it's the opposite. The most ethical people in history were often the ones who refused to complete the checklist. The ones who said, I won't sign this paper, or I won't stand by, or I won't stay silent. They broke rules, they disrupted norms, they made people uncomfortable because they understood that morality is not about appearances, it's about integrity. You might feel tempted to believe that as long as you follow your checklist, be kind, be honest, be respectful, you don't have to do the hard work of reflection. But the moment you stop reflecting, you become rigid. You start defending your habits as inherently good, even when they become harmful. You cling to the checklist because it feels safe. It gives you a sense of control and certainty. But real ethics are messy. They require humility, curiosity, and the willingness to admit when you're wrong. The checklist can't do that for you. Only you can. So, next time you feel proud of how perfectly you followed the rules, pause and ask yourself, why do I believe these rules are right? Who benefits from them? Who gets hurt by them? What would I do if the rules disappeared? That's where you find the roots of your morality, not in the habits you perform automatically, but in the questions you dare to ask. Because a habit without reflection is just obedience, and obedience alone is never enough. You are not your checklist. You are not your compliance. You are the sum of your choices, the questions you ask, and the courage you show when the rules fail to capture what's right. The world doesn't need more obedient people. It needs more people who are willing to think, to feel, and to choose their values deliberately. So, close your checklist for a moment. Look inside yourself. And remember, you are not here to perform goodness. You are here to live it. Trauma purity filter. You've been told a comforting story that trauma makes you wiser, that suffering is a hidden blessing that purifies you, that if you endure enough, you will become someone more authentic, more worthy of respect. This idea is repeated in movies, in books, in quiet conversations. It feels reassuring to believe your pain has a purpose. It means everything you lost, everything that broke you, wasn't in vain. But not all pain transforms you. Not all wounds become wisdom. Some injuries just remain, slow, invisible poison that seeps into everything you do. You can call yourself a survivor, but survival isn't always the same as healing. Sometimes, it's just a word you use to disguise how much you still hurt. Look closer at how we romanticize trauma. We admire the person who suffered, assuming they must have special insight. We say things like, "You're so strong," as if that strength was a prize they willingly fought for. But many people didn't choose their pain. They didn't choose to grow up in violence, to endure betrayal, to be shaped by loss. They didn't want the lessons. They only wanted safety. When you praise their resilience without acknowledging the cost, you participate in a story that minimizes harm. You pretend that all suffering is a pathway to virtue, when sometimes it's just senseless destruction. Think about the child who learns to read every tiny shift in a parent's mood. They develop a hyper-awareness that looks like empathy. But it was never about understanding others. It was about survival. That skill becomes a reflex. Later in life, they call it intuition. People admire it, but it was built in fear. It doesn't make them special. It makes them someone who never felt safe enough to relax. Consider the person who grows up surrounded by chaos. They learn to never depend on anyone, to never show need. Later, they are praised for being independent, for never asking for help. But that independence is not freedom. It's a scar. It's the absence of trust. And when you call it strength, you miss the pain that created it. Not all trauma leads to clarity or compassion. Sometimes it breeds suspicion, bitterness, and numbness. Sometimes it convinces you that love is dangerous, that hope is foolish. These aren't lessons. They are defenses. They don't purify you. They build walls you can't see over. Healing doesn't happen just because you survived. It's not automatic. It's not inevitable. You have to choose it again and again. You have to question the beliefs your trauma taught you. The belief that you have to earn love by enduring. That you're only worthy if you keep proving your strength. That your suffering has to mean something. Sometimes the truth is simpler and harder. Sometimes the pain you lived through didn't teach you anything. It just hurt you. It took pieces of your trust and joy that may never fully return. You don't have to pretend that's noble. You don't have to craft a story about how your suffering made you beautiful. You are allowed to grieve what you lost without making it sacred. You are allowed to say, "This was cruel. This damaged me, and I'm still here." That is enough. You don't have to extract meaning from every wound to justify your healing. You don't have to wear your scars like a badge. This doesn't mean you are broken forever. It means you are human. It means you get to decide who you become, even if your pain never fully leaves. It means you can refuse the myth that all trauma refines. You can let go of the purity filter and admit that some things simply left you raw. Some memories will never be gifts. You deserve peace without performing resilience. You deserve love without proving how much you've suffered. You are more than what happened to you. You are more than the stories you tell yourself about your strength. You don't have to keep proving you survived. You don't have to keep acting like you're grateful for the lessons that never came. This is your life. This is your story. You get to choose what you build from the wreckage, and you don't owe your pain anything. Education equals wisdom bias. You've been taught since childhood that education is the ultimate proof of intelligence, that the more facts you memorize, the more degrees you collect, the wiser you become. It sounds obvious, almost sacred. But what if this belief isn't as pure as it seems? What if knowing is not the same as understanding? What if our culture rewards the storage of knowledge but ignores the soul that makes wisdom possible? Think about this. You can read every book on love and still fail at compassion. You can memorize every law and still be unjust. You can recite every historical date and still be blind to the patterns that keep repeating. Education, in its traditional form, is a system of accumulation. You gather information, stack credentials, build a wall of evidence that you are educated. But wisdom isn't a wall. It's a window, one that requires you to look out, to question, to see yourself reflected in what you learn. Consider the person who spends years in academia, publishing papers and earning accolades, yet lacks the humility to admit when they're wrong. Or the professional with a perfect resume, but no capacity to empathize with those they serve. This is the education equals wisdom bias. It convinces us that expertise alone is virtue, that diplomas are a guarantee of insight, that credentials are a shortcut to enlightenment. But if you look closer, you'll see the cracks. You'll see people with prestigious degrees who can't manage their own egos, Leaders who know all the theories of ethics, yet exploit the people under them. Scholars who can quote philosophy, but never question their own prejudices. Knowledge without introspection becomes armor. It makes you feel safe, superior, invulnerable. But wisdom is the opposite of armor. It requires vulnerability, the willingness to admit you don't know, to listen, to feel. Imagine someone who spends years studying nutrition, but never heals their own relationship with food, or someone who teaches psychology, yet has never examined their own trauma. This is what happens when knowing becomes more important than understanding. Information becomes a disguise. You appear educated, but you remain unchanged. Our culture fuels this bias because it loves symbols of success. A degree is tangible, measurable. A title is easy to celebrate. But wisdom can't be quantified. You can't hang it on a wall or stamp it with honors. It's invisible until you watch how a person lives, how they treat others, how they respond to uncertainty. There is nothing wrong with education itself. Learning is powerful, but it becomes dangerous when it is mistaken for transformation. When a person believes that knowing enough facts makes them immune to error, or that the right vocabulary excuses them from humility. That is when education becomes a performance instead of a practice. This bias has consequences. It builds hierarchies that privilege the educated over the intuitive. It dismisses the insights of those without formal credentials. It tells people that if they haven't been formally taught, their wisdom doesn't count. But some of the deepest truths you'll ever hear come from people who never set foot in a university. The grandmother who has lived through war and loss, the worker who has survived injustice and still shows kindness, the friend who doesn't know all the terminology, but knows exactly how to hold space when you're in pain. Wisdom grows in the messy soil of experience, reflection, and courage. It requires you to use what you know, not just repeat it, to integrate, not just memorize. You can't outsource this process to a degree or an institution. You have to do the work yourself. Next time you feel intimidated by someone's credentials, pause. Remember that education is only a tool, a powerful one, but not a guarantee of depth. And when you catch yourself dismissing your own insights because you don't have a certificate to prove them, remember this. Wisdom doesn't need permission to exist. It only needs you to honor it. Likewise, when you feel the temptation to lean on your own education as proof that you are right, take a breath. Ask yourself, am I using my knowledge to connect or to dominate? Am I hiding behind what I've learned because I'm afraid to admit what I don't understand? Am I willing to be a student again, even when it costs me my image? Because in the end, the people who change the world aren't the ones who know the most. They're the ones who remain open, who keep listening, who never confuse expertise with empathy, who are brave enough to question even their most cherished knowledge. So let go of the education equals wisdom bias. Let go of the illusion that knowing alone makes you wise. And remember, the mind can be full while the heart remains empty. True wisdom is the moment you realize that the two are meant to grow together. Intuition is absolute truth. We all love to romanticize intuition. That sudden surge of knowing, that spark that feels older than thought itself. People call it gut feeling, sixth sense, inner compass. Whatever the name, it carries the weight of something sacred, like a private channel to the truth no one else can access. But intuition is not some magical revelation from the universe. More often, it's a fast pattern, an echo of all your past experiences, fears, and assumptions compressed into a single instant. Just because it feels divine doesn't mean it's accurate. Think of how often we confuse familiarity for truth. You meet someone, and your intuition insists they can't be trusted. But is that really insight? Or is it your past projecting itself onto the present? Maybe they remind you of someone who once betrayed you. Maybe their tone triggers an old insecurity you never healed. Your mind doesn't always distinguish between a real threat and an old memory. It simply reacts. And because intuition bypasses deliberate reasoning, it feels pure, unfiltered. But that's precisely why it can be so misleading. Consider this. If intuition were truly infallible, humans wouldn't need science, evidence, or debate. We'd all just sit quietly, listening to our gut feelings, and we'd agree on reality. But we don't. In fact, intuition often guides people in opposite directions. Two people can look at the same event and feel completely different certainties. One feels a sense of doom. Another feels hope. Which one is correct? The truth is, feelings are not reality. They are interpretations, and they can be corrupted by trauma, culture, and bias. Imagine you're walking home late at night and you see a stranger approaching. Your heart races, your stomach knots, instinct screams danger. But what if your fear has nothing to do with this person? What if your intuition is replaying every frightening story you've absorbed about strangers in the dark? The feeling is real. The certainty is real. But the conclusion could be utterly false. This doesn't mean you should ignore your instincts, but you should learn to question them. Because intuition has no built-in filter to separate useful signals from old noise. Think about relationships. How many people stay in unhealthy dynamics because their intuition tells them it's love? They mistake familiarity for destiny. If you grew up around chaos, your intuition might feel calm in the presence of chaos. If you learned early that love meant sacrifice, your intuition might celebrate every situation that demands you shrink yourself. These reflexes don't emerge from wisdom. They grow from repetition. They feel ancient because they are ancient, but they're not necessarily right. Even in professional settings, intuition can deceive. An experienced investor might feel certain about a decision because it resembles past successes, but markets change. Patterns that once worked can fail. Yet the more confidence you have in your instincts, the harder it is to see when they were wrong. This is why entire industries are built on data, research, and testing, because intuition alone is a fragile foundation. It can inspire a hypothesis, but it shouldn't be the final verdict. There's also the matter of ego. Intuition flatters us. It whispers that we are special, that we possess insights others can't comprehend. And that seduction is powerful. If you've ever felt sure of something while everyone around you disagreed, you know the thrill of believing you alone see the truth. But sometimes, that thrill is just a hallucination of certainty. It's possible to be completely convinced and completely mistaken. Confidence is not evidence. This doesn't mean intuition has no value. It's an incredible tool. It helps us navigate complexity without overthinking every detail. It can detect subtle patterns faster than our conscious mind. But intuition is a starting point, not a conclusion. It needs verification. If you feel something strongly, ask yourself why. Where does this feeling come from? Is it based on direct experience or something you were taught? Is it arising from clarity or from fear? One way to test your intuition is to look for disconfirming evidence. If you're convinced someone can't be trusted, look for examples of their integrity. If you feel a plan is doomed, search for reasons it could succeed. The goal isn't to paralyze yourself with doubt. It's to ensure your intuition isn't masquerading as absolute truth when it's only a reflex. Remember, instinct evolved to help us survive in a simpler world. A rustle in the bushes meant danger, so we ran. A familiar face meant safety, so we stayed. But modern life is more nuanced. The signals are less clear. What feels like danger might be opportunity. What feels like certainty might be bias. If you rely on intuition alone, you risk reducing the complexity of life into a series of gut reactions that may not serve you. So, the next time your intuition speaks, listen carefully, but don't kneel before it. Treat it as a valuable clue, not a final answer. Investigate its origins. Test its predictions. Give yourself permission to question even the feelings that feel the most convincing, because intuition can lie with confidence, and the only way to find the truth is to look beyond what feels true toward what actually is. Stoicism as suppression. You are told from the first moments you learn to name your feelings that composure is power, that calm is wisdom, that to react emotionally is a sign of weakness, instability, or childishness. You are praised when you show restraint, when you keep your face still and your voice even. You learn quickly that the world values your ability to appear unaffected, and so you begin to practice the art of suppression. You call it stoicism. You call it maturity. But sometimes it's not strength. Sometimes it's just a freeze response, masquerading as virtue. Think about how often you have swallowed your feelings to avoid making others uncomfortable. How often you've told yourself that staying rational meant ignoring the ache in your chest or the lump in your throat. You called it discipline, but really it was a kind of self-abandonment, a learned reflex that taught you to disconnect from yourself in order to be more palatable to others. This is the hidden side of Stoicism that no one warns you about. The ancient Stoics taught acceptance of what you can't control and the practice of equanimity in adversity. But somewhere along the way, the philosophy became a cultural script. Never show vulnerability. Never let them see you tremble. Never admit you care enough to hurt. And so, The practice of clear-eyed perspective turned into a performance of indifference. It feels noble to be unmoved. It feels powerful to say nothing can touch me. But this posture often has a price, the slow erosion of your capacity to feel. You can tell yourself that you are transcending pain, but sometimes you are simply burying it so deep you can no longer sense its presence. Imagine a child whose parents punished any sign of emotion. If she cried, she was mocked. If she showed anger, she was sent to her room. She learned that feelings were dangerous, that to survive, she must become an iceberg. Years later, she is admired for her composure. She is called stoic. No one sees that beneath her calm is a lifetime of unprocessed grief. Or think of the man who decided long ago that expressing sadness was unmanly. He hardened himself. He learned to speak in measured tones, to offer solutions instead of comfort. He tells himself he is rational. He believes that emotion clouds judgment, but he doesn't realize that his numbness is not wisdom. It's an old wound he never tended to. This is why it's so important to distinguish between genuine equanimity and emotional suppression. Real stoicism is not the absence of feeling. It is the ability to feel fully and still respond thoughtfully. To acknowledge the storm inside without letting it dictate your every move. Suppression, on the other hand, is a refusal to feel at all. It is a shutting down, a freezing, and over time, it can calcify into a life of quiet despair. If you have ever wondered why your relationships feel flat, why joy feels muted, or why you can't access your own sadness even when you know you should be grieving, it might be because you have mistaken suppression for serenity. You have learned to flatten the peaks and valleys of your inner world so convincingly that you can no longer tell where your real self ends and your performance begins. And it's easy to justify. The world rewards this posture. In workplaces, in families, in friendships, you are admired for your composure. People will call you reliable, mature, balanced. No one will ask whether your stoicism is born of wisdom or fear. No one will question whether you have simply numbed yourself so completely that nothing moves you anymore. The danger of this kind of suppression is that it doesn't disappear. The feelings you refuse to acknowledge don't evaporate. They collect in the body. They become tension in your shoulders, a tightness in your chest, a heaviness behind your eyes. You might tell yourself you're fine, that you've risen above your emotions, but your body always keeps score. When you are cut off from your feelings, you are also cut off from your intuition, from your vitality, from the very signals that tell you what matters, what hurts, and what you need to heal. You become an efficient machine, but you stop being a whole human being. Consider how different it feels to say, I am feeling intense sadness right now, but I choose not to act on it, versus, I don't feel anything. The first is presence, the second is absence, and one is far closer to real strength than the other. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote about accepting pain as part of the natural order, but he did not advocate denying it. He did not pretend that to be stoic was to be inhuman. He knew that life would wound you. The question was not whether you would feel pain, but how you would meet it. When you refuse to meet your pain, you don't transcend it. You bury it alive. And what is buried alive never dies. It seeps into your relationships as irritability, into your work as disengagement, into your body as exhaustion. It finds ways to surface, often in the moments you least expect. So, if you have been told that stoicism means never crying, never raging, never trembling, consider that you may have been taught a false lesson. Real stoicism is the capacity to face your emotions without being consumed by them, not the refusal to feel them at all. There is no virtue in pretending you are unaffected by life. There is no wisdom in refusing to acknowledge your own humanity. The goal is not to be an unfeeling statue. The goal is to be fully alive and yet not enslaved by every passing impulse. The next time you feel something rising in you, a sadness, an anger, a longing, pause before you silence it. Notice the instinct to clamp down, to freeze, to dismiss. Ask yourself, am I truly at peace with this feeling, or am I afraid to let it move through me? Because the courage to feel is often far greater than the courage to suppress. The willingness to say, yes, this hurts, yes, this matters, yes, I am human, is the beginning of real freedom. And maybe that's the most radical thing you can do, to reclaim your right to feel, to refuse the performance of perpetual calm, to understand that being stoic is not about denying your pain, but about holding it with enough presence that it doesn't become your prison. You don't have to be frozen to be strong. You don't have to be numb to be wise. You can feel everything and still choose your response. You can be fully alive and still be grounded. You can be human and still be whole. And perhaps, when you let yourself feel again, you will discover that what you thought was strength was only survival. That the truest strength is not found in the absence of feeling, but in the willingness to embrace every trembling, vivid, unruly part of yourself. Poverty equals laziness. Trap. You've been conditioned to believe a simple equation. If you work hard, you will succeed. If you don't succeed, it must be because you didn't work hard enough. This story is so pervasive, so seductive, that you hardly question it. You see someone who is wealthy, and you assume they must have been disciplined, brilliant, unstoppable. You see someone who is poor, and you assume they must have been careless, unmotivated, lazy. But this story is a trap. It's a lie built to protect the comfortable from the discomfort of empathy. Because if poverty is always the result of laziness, you don't have to ask whether the game was rigged. You don't have to see the invisible scaffolding that holds some people up while letting others fall. You can sit safely in your certainty, convinced that you earned everything you have, and that those without must deserve their lack. But look closer, and you'll see the cracks in this illusion. You'll find janitors working night shifts while raising children alone. You'll meet farm workers bent over fields for 12 hours a day in blistering heat. You'll encounter home health aides who bathe, feed, and care for the elderly with infinite patience, earning barely enough to pay rent. Are these people lazy? Is their poverty proof that they haven't tried? Or is it evidence that the code that distributes rewards has nothing to do with virtue? Because effort is everywhere. You can't walk through a low-income neighborhood without feeling the sheer magnitude of human exertion. People are hustling, stretching, sacrificing every hour. But the rewards of that effort are not determined by how hard they work. They're determined by where they started, who they know, what credentials they could afford, what emergencies derailed them, what biases filtered their opportunities, what accidents of birth set the stage. Consider the child born into generational poverty. From the first day of their life, they are navigating scarcity. The school they attend is underfunded. Their neighborhood is unsafe. Their parents are exhausted, juggling multiple jobs. Every setback costs more because there is no cushion to absorb it. When that child grows up, they are expected to compete with peers who started the race miles ahead, armed with tutors, stable housing, healthy meals, and networks of support. And when they struggle, the system calls them lazy, as if resilience can magically erase the structural barriers, as if sheer willpower can substitute for inherited advantage. Then look at the other end of the spectrum, the person born into wealth. They are praised for their drive and their discipline, but often those qualities are nurtured by safety nets. They can take risks because failure isn't catastrophic. They can intern for free because their bills are paid. They can start businesses because there is family capital waiting to be invested. Their effort is real, but it is leveraged by resources they did not create. And when their ventures succeed, we call them self-made. We celebrate their hustle, their grind, their entrepreneurial spirit, without acknowledging that thousands of equally hard-working people never even got a chance to compete. This is why the poverty equals laziness trap is so effective. It hides the complexity of inequality behind a moral fable. It tells you that success is proof of virtue and failure is proof of vice. It allows the privileged to feel superior and the struggling to feel ashamed. And shame is a powerful silencer. When you internalize the belief that your poverty is a personal failing, you stop demanding fairness. You stop asking why the rewards are distributed so unevenly. You turn your frustration inward and blame yourself. Think about how often you hear phrases like, "They just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps," as if the bootstraps were ever handed out equally, as if some people aren't still waiting for boots at all. The phrase itself is absurd. Nobody can levitate by tugging on their own shoes. But that's the mythology we teach, that everyone has the same tools, the same chances, the same starting line. And if you can't build an empire from nothing, you must simply be unwilling to try. You see this in policy debates when social safety nets are framed as indulgences for the undeserving. You see it in workplaces when low-wage employees are treated as expendable, their labor essential, but their dignity optional. You see it in the smug narratives of the wealthy, who insist that their fortune is entirely the product of their character. But no amount of spin changes the fact that effort alone does not guarantee prosperity. Effort is necessary, but it is never sufficient. Opportunity is what transforms effort into success. Without it, you are running on a treadmill that never moves forward, no matter how fast you sprint. And yet, you are taught to admire those who flaunt their wealth, as evidence of their superiority. You are taught to distrust those who struggle, as if they must be scheming or irresponsible. You are taught to see poverty as a personal flaw, rather than a systemic outcome. This conditioning serves a purpose. It keeps you from questioning the architecture of inequality. It keeps you from recognizing that your fate is shaped by countless variables you did not choose. It keeps you from feeling solidarity with those who have less because you've been convinced that their hardship is deserved. But here is the truth. Wealth does not automatically reflect virtue. Poverty does not automatically reflect vice. If you want to see character, don't measure bank accounts. Look instead at how people treat others when there is no profit in it. Look at whether they use their power to protect or to exploit. Look at whether they can see beyond the illusion of their own entitlement. Because the world is filled with decent, brilliant, resilient people who will never be rich. Not because they failed, but because the code rewards inherited advantage, not moral worth. So when you find yourself tempted to equate poverty with laziness, pause and ask, what don't I see? What struggles are hidden behind the curtain? What stories am I telling myself to feel comfortable with my own privilege? That discomfort is where understanding begins. And understanding is the first step toward compassion, toward justice, toward building a society where effort is honored and opportunity is shared. Because in the end, a world that measures virtue by wealth is a world that has lost its moral compass. And you deserve better than that illusion. We all do. Equal treatment fallacy. You hear it everywhere. The idea that treating everyone equally is the highest form of fairness, that if you simply apply the same rules to everyone, you have done your duty. It sounds noble. It sounds simple. But simplicity often hides a darker truth. Because when people do not start from the same place, when their obstacles are not the same, treating them identically is not justice. It is a quiet form of cruelty. Imagine a race where one runner starts at the finish line and another begins miles behind. If you announce that everyone must run the same distance from wherever they stand, you can claim neutrality. You can pretend you have done nothing wrong, but you have guaranteed that only one of them ever has a chance to win. This is what happens when we confuse equal treatment with equity. In schools, this fallacy is everywhere. A child whose family can afford tutors, books, and a quiet room for homework will often outperform a child whose nights are filled with hunger and chaos. If you insist they take the same tests, graded by the same standards, you call it fairness. But what you really measure is privilege. You measure who had more support long before they stepped into the classroom. And when you punish the child who falls behind, you pretend their failure is personal, not systemic. Consider the workplace. When promotions are awarded based on who speaks up the most, who works the longest hours, who networks at the right events, it looks like meritocracy. But what if some employees are caring for sick relatives? What if others grew up believing their voice didn't matter? What if some never had mentors to show them how to navigate hidden expectations? Equal treatment says everyone had the same chance. Reality says otherwise. Even in the justice system, this fallacy thrives. Sentencing guidelines often claim to be neutral. They apply the same penalties to everyone convicted of the same crime. But when certain communities are policed more aggressively, when poverty drives desperation, when bias infects every step of prosecution, equal punishment becomes a way to launder inequality. You can pretend the scales are balanced, but the weight was rigged long before the sentence was pronounced. This isn't an argument against accountability or standards. It is an argument against pretending that everyone arrives at those standards from the same conditions. True fairness requires us to look beyond appearances, to ask harder questions, to recognize that some people need more support, more understanding, more space to grow. Yet, we cling to equal treatment because it feels easier. It relieves us of the burden of context. We can shrug and say, I treated everyone the same, as if sameness is the same as justice. But justice is not blind. It is not a machine that stamps identical labels on every life. It is a living practice that demands we see people in their full circumstances. Think of a classroom again. A teacher who insists every child completes the same homework, without asking who has internet access or who spends evenings caring for siblings, is not fair. They are simply indifferent. The same applies to policies that claim neutrality but enforce old hierarchies. Equality without equity is a mask. It lets institutions claim virtue while preserving advantage. It allows the comfortable to stay comfortable and the disadvantaged to keep struggling. And when the inevitable gaps appear, we blame individuals instead of questioning the structures that made their success harder. When you treat everyone exactly the same, you risk ignoring what makes them different. You ignore the barriers that some have to climb just to stand where others began. You ignore histories of exclusion, discrimination, and poverty. And in that ignorance, you commit a subtler kind of harm. Real fairness asks more of us. It asks us to notice who is unheard, who is unseen, who is carrying burdens that aren't immediately visible. It asks us to design systems that don't just look equal on paper, but feel fair in practice. That may mean giving more resources to those who started with less. It may mean creating pathways that recognize the reality of different lives. This isn't about pity. It's about honesty. It's about admitting that if you care about justice, you can't pretend every person arrives at your door with the same tools. You can't pretend that a rule applied identically will create identical opportunities. You can't call it fairness if you never ask whether everyone had a real chance to begin with. Equal treatment sounds pure. It sounds logical. But without equity, it becomes a way to protect privilege. It becomes an excuse to avoid the discomfort of acknowledging how uneven the world really is. You can keep pretending that sameness is fairness, or you can choose to see the truth, that real justice is messy, complex, and requires courage. It demands you stop hiding behind the illusion that treating everyone equally is enough. Calmness is truth bias. We love to believe that calmness equals wisdom, that the person who speaks gently must be the one who understands, that the calm voice in the argument is the voice of truth. But calm is not always evidence of insight. Sometimes it's a strategy, a mask, a form of control. And sometimes the person who is trembling or shouting or crying is the only one brave enough to feel the full weight of reality. Think about an argument you've witnessed or been part of. One person is composed, collected, measured in their words. The other is emotional, their voice cracking, their body tense. We're trained to see this contrast and assume the calm one must be correct. After all, if they weren't, wouldn't they be flustered? Wouldn't they be defensive? But the ability to remain calm isn't proof of moral authority. It's often just proof of practice. Practice at performing composure, practice at suppressing feeling, practice at appearing unbothered, even when they know they're wrong. This is what psychologists call calmness bias, the illusion that the calmest voice is the most rational. In reality, calmness is often just a socially rewarded posture. The calm person gets to claim the moral high ground. They get to frame the other person's passion as evidence of instability or irrationality. But that framing is a tactic. It's a way to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. Consider how this shows up in workplaces. A manager delivers harmful feedback in a neutral tone, and if you respond emotionally, they label you unprofessional. Your reaction becomes the problem, not the content of what was said. Or think about politics. A leader who calmly denies the reality of people's suffering is often seen as more credible than an activist who raises their voice in outrage, but who is actually closer to the truth, the one who can't help but feel it, or the one who can bury it beneath a veneer of detachment. There's also a darker side to calmness. Some people weaponize it. They know that by remaining perfectly still, perfectly measured, they can provoke you into reacting. And once you react, they can dismiss everything you say as emotional noise. This is a form of gaslighting, forcing you to doubt your own perception because you couldn't keep your composure under the weight of their denial. They make you believe your passion is proof you're untrustworthy, that your urgency is a defect. And yet, sometimes panic is the most honest reaction. If you've been silent for years, if you've swallowed injustice and betrayal again and again, the moment you finally speak might come out as a scream. That doesn't mean your truth is less real. It means you've reached the limits of suppression. Your body refuses to pretend anymore. Calmness can be discipline, but it can also be numbness. And numbness can look impressive while being hollow. Look at personal relationships. How often does the calm partner in a conflict claim the moral advantage? They say, "You're overreacting," or "You're being dramatic." But maybe the reason you're emotional is that you've been ignored. Maybe your panic is your last defense against being erased. When someone uses calmness as a shield, it's easy to start believing you are the unreasonable one. But emotions are information. They don't vanish because they're inconvenient. Think about history. Major social movements didn't happen because everyone was calm. They happened because people got loud, because they cried, because they shouted, because they refused to speak in the measured tones that keep power comfortable. If you believe calmness is always synonymous with truth, you will overlook the people who are risking everything to break the silence. You will ignore urgency in favor of style. This doesn't mean that calmness has no place. Sometimes, staying steady in a crisis is necessary. Sometimes, calm allows clarity. But if you automatically assign moral authority to the calm voice, you are easy to manipulate. You will dismiss the person who is overwhelmed by the truth simply because they can't deliver it with perfect composure. And you will believe the person who has rehearsed their detachment simply because they look unshaken. The next time you find yourself in a conflict, pay attention to this reflex. Notice when you start to discount someone's perspective because they're emotional. Ask yourself, are they emotional because they are unreasonable or because they are exhausted by being unheard? Are they panicking because they're unstable or because they've finally run out of ways to pretend everything is fine? Also, ask yourself whether your own calmness is authentic or strategic. Are you genuinely at peace with what's happening, or are you avoiding feeling anything at all? Are you dismissing others because it's easier than examining your own part in the conflict? Calmness can feel safer than vulnerability, but it can also be an escape. So when you hear the calm voice, don't automatically assume it carries the truth. When you see the trembling hands, don't assume they're proof of weakness. The calm person may be centered, or they may be hiding. The agitated person may be unraveling, or they may be the only one telling the truth out loud. Wisdom isn't measured in decibels. Truth doesn't always arrive in a whisper. Sometimes it comes in a roar. Sometimes it shakes. Sometimes it breaks. And your job is not to judge the messenger by their volume or their tears, but to ask what's real beneath the performance, whether that performance is calmness or chaos. Because calmness is not truth. It's just a surface. And sometimes, the truth is so big it refuses to stay quiet. Growth equals healing lie. You've been told that growth is always good, that any evolution, any transformation, any step forward is automatically healing. That if you just keep progressing, learning new skills, building new habits, achieving new milestones, you will inevitably mend what is broken inside you. But this is a comforting illusion. Not all growth is healing. Sometimes growth is just a more sophisticated disguise. Sometimes it's the art of constructing a stronger mask while the same old wounds keep bleeding underneath. Think about the people you know who appear unstoppable, the ones who never stop moving, never stop achieving, never stop improving themselves. You might envy them, their drive, their polish, their relentless energy. But look closer, and you'll often see that their growth is a form of escape. They don't slow down because slowing down would mean facing the truth they've spent their entire life outrunning. Imagine someone who has learned how to dominate a room, to lead teams, to build a business empire, but who still feels unworthy of love the moment they are alone. Or the person who can recite every self-help mantra, but still wakes up every morning with a crushing sense of shame. This is what happens when you mistake growth for healing. You become more impressive to everyone else while staying just as fractured inside. Our culture rewards this kind of growth. It celebrates the glow-up, the transformation, the reinvention. You post the before and after photos. You talk about how far you've come. But rarely do you talk about how much of your growth was driven by fear. Fear of being ordinary. Fear of being unlovable. Fear of being exposed. And fear is a powerful motivator. It can push you to achieve things you never imagined. But it doesn't heal you. It just pushes you to build taller walls. The lie sounds so seductive. If you just get stronger, you will also get healthier. But strength and health are not the same. You can strengthen your armor while your wounds remain infected. You can master your craft while never learning how to sit with your own pain. You can evolve into a more convincing version of yourself without ever becoming more honest. Look at the people who preach constant improvement, constant upgrading, constant hustle. Notice how often their energy has an edge of desperation. Notice how the moment they stop moving, all the ghosts catch up. Because growth that isn't rooted in self-awareness is often just another way to run. Healing asks something different from you. Healing isn't about becoming impressive. It's about becoming real. It requires slowing down long enough to feel the ache you've been hiding. It requires telling the truth about how you got those scars in the first place. It requires grieving what you lost before you knew you had it. And there is nothing glamorous about this process. You don't get applause for it. You don't get viral posts celebrating it. You get quiet, unremarkable moments of reckoning with yourself. Sometimes healing looks like less striving, less proving, less performing. Sometimes it looks like stepping away from the arenas where you have been trying to win approval you never actually needed. Sometimes it looks like letting go of goals that were never really yours. This doesn't mean growth is worthless. Growth can be beautiful. It can create space for healing, but only if you're willing to ask why you're growing. Are you evolving because you love yourself enough to expand, or because you hate yourself too much to stop? You can't heal what you refuse to feel. You can't mend what you keep hiding behind achievements, and you can't call it wholeness if it depends on constant motion. True healing often begins when you allow yourself to be still, when you allow the facade to crack, when you admit that you are tired of carrying the performance. Consider the person who finally steps back from their high-powered career to reconnect with their family, even though it means becoming invisible in the eyes of the world. Or the person who stops pretending to be the expert and starts learning to ask for help. Or the person who chooses therapy over another certification. These acts don't look like growth in the traditional sense, but they are acts of courage. They are moments when you decide that your humanity matters more than your image. Growth is easy to measure. You can count your followers, your income, your accolades. Healing doesn't come with metrics. It shows up in subtler ways. The way you speak to yourself when you fail, the way you treat others when they disappoint you, the way you can sit alone without needing distraction, the way you can tell the truth even when it costs you approval. The next time you find yourself reaching for a new project, a new goal, a new identity, ask yourself, is this growth or is this avoidance? Are you becoming more of yourself or just a more polished version of the same wounded performer? Are you expanding your life or just expanding the mask? Because no matter how strong the mask becomes, it will never feel like peace. And no amount of achievements can fill the hollow place where your unhealed self still waits to be seen. So remember, not all growth is healing. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is to stop growing long enough to feel what's real. Because in that quiet space, without your armor, you may finally discover that you were worthy of healing all along. Objectivity, illusion frame. You are told from the start that objectivity is the highest virtue, that if you can strip away your emotions, your culture, your memories, you will see the world as it really is. You are taught that facts stand alone, like stones in a river, waiting to be collected by minds clear enough to recognize them. You hear that bias is weakness, that neutrality is strength. But what if this idea of pure objectivity is itself an illusion? What if every lens you look through is already tinted by everything you've been taught to ignore? Imagine you are handed a camera and told to photograph reality. You assume the camera is neutral. But what if the lens is smudged? What if the settings distort the colors? What if you've been trained only to look in certain directions and call that the full picture? This is what happens when we talk about objectivity without questioning who defines it. Think about the history you were taught in school. Whose victories were celebrated? Whose suffering was a footnote? The stories that shaped your understanding of what is normal, what is valuable, what is true, those were curated by someone. And even if the facts themselves were accurate, the selection of which facts mattered was never neutral. Objectivity always has an editor, or consider journalism. We praise reporters who are objective, who keep their distance from the story. But distance is not the same as truth. Sometimes, staying neutral is an act of erasure. When a journalist covers injustice but never names the systems that create it, when they report on suffering but never ask why it exists, they are not being objective. They are upholding the status quo. You see the same thing in science. We love to say that science is free from bias, that data is the purest expression of reality. But scientists are humans. They decide which questions to ask, which variables to measure, which hypotheses are worth funding. The data itself is shaped by what they choose to see and what they choose not to see. Even your personal observations are colored by your past. You might think you are evaluating a situation calmly, but your judgments are woven with threads of old experiences and beliefs. You call someone unreliable because they remind you of someone who once betrayed you. You dismiss an idea because it challenges a story you built your life around. You think you are being rational, but often you are just protecting the frame that makes you feel safe. This doesn't mean objectivity is impossible, but it does mean it is not a place you arrive. It's a process, a practice of asking, what am I missing? Whose perspective am I leaving out? What have I been conditioned to see as natural or inevitable? Real clarity doesn't come from pretending you have no lens. It comes from understanding that you do, and learning to clean it again and again. Consider how often people claim to be objective when they are simply detached. Detachment feels cleaner, less messy. But sometimes, it's an excuse to avoid feeling, to avoid responsibility. When you pretend that objectivity means never caring, you stop yourself from taking action. You become a spectator to suffering, convinced that your passivity is a form of virtue. Imagine a doctor who says they treat every patient exactly the same. That sounds fair. But if they ignore the social and economic conditions that shape health, if they refuse to see how poverty or racism affects outcomes, they are not being objective. They are being blind. True objectivity isn't the absence of perspective. It's the integration of as many perspectives as possible. It's the humility to admit that you don't see everything, that your mind, like every mind, is shaped by stories you didn't choose. The next time you feel certain that your view is the most rational, pause. Ask yourself, whose voices am I excluding? What assumptions am I carrying that I've never examined? You will discover that clarity doesn't come from denying your filters. It comes from recognizing them. From understanding that every frame has edges, and every lens leaves something out. So be cautious when you hear someone claim they are purely objective. Remember that objectivity is not a static state. It is a commitment to curiosity, a willingness to let go of the comforting myth that your view is the only one that matters. It is the courage to admit that you are always in the frame, whether you want to be or not. Logic without soul trap. You live in an age that worships logic, the clean calculation, the elegant algorithm, the promise that if you just think clearly enough, you will arrive at truth. You see it in the way decisions are justified with metrics and models. You hear it in the language of efficiency, optimization, rationality. You're told that emotions are dangerous, that empathy clouds judgment, that feelings get in the way of progress. So, you learn to split yourself in two, to let the logical part of you lead and the human part of you trail behind. But this split comes at a cost, because when logic is separated from empathy, it becomes something cold, something brittle, something capable of inflicting harm without remorse. This is the logic without soul trap. The illusion that reason alone is enough to build a just world. Imagine a corporate boardroom where executives decide to lay off thousands of workers because a spreadsheet shows that profits will rise. The numbers are clean, precise, undeniable. The equation says that cutting salaries increases shareholder value. But what the equation cannot capture is the reality of a single mother who will lose her income, the elderly employee who will lose his health insurance, the community that will lose its stability. Logic says the decision is fair, necessary, rational. But logic without empathy is a scalpel that cuts indiscriminately. It does not feel the wound it leaves behind. Consider public policy decisions that rely on abstract statistics to decide who is worthy of help. A formula determines who gets food assistance. An algorithm decides who is eligible for housing. A cost-benefit analysis dictates how much support a disabled person deserves. Each decision can be justified with graphs and charts. Each outcome can be explained as the optimal use of resources. And yet, behind every data point is a life that doesn't fit neatly into a model, a person whose pain can't be graphed. But when logic rules without soul, these nuances are erased. All that remains is the illusion of fairness. A fairness that feels objective but delivers cruelty in increments so small, nobody notices the cumulative damage. Think about the justice system, the sentencing guidelines designed to ensure consistency, the risk assessments that predict future behavior, the policies that impose mandatory minimums, all of them grounded in data, logic, precedent. But in their pursuit of rationality, they often strip away the very thing that makes justice humane, the ability to see the person behind the crime, the capacity to ask, what circumstances shaped this life? What hope remains for redemption? Logic alone doesn't ask those questions. It doesn't care. It only measures. It only compares. It only concludes. And in doing so, it becomes a machine that delivers punishment without compassion. You see this dynamic in medicine too. Healthcare decisions based purely on actuarial tables. Treatments denied because the cost exceeds a threshold. Procedures rationed because the patient's projected life years don't justify the expense. The logic is clear. The math is unassailable. But the person on the receiving end is left with nothing but a quiet devastation. To be told that your worth has been calculated and found wanting, that your existence is too expensive to sustain. This is what happens when logic is severed from empathy. It creates systems that look fair on paper but feel monstrous in reality. And yet, you're encouraged to admire these systems, to believe that they represent the height of human progress, that feelings are primitive, that sentimentality is weakness, that compassion is a distraction. But if you look closely, you'll see that this worship of pure logic is just another way to avoid accountability, because empathy demands that you feel the consequences of your decisions, that you see yourself in the suffering of others, that you allow your heart to complicate the clean lines of your reasoning. Logic without soul doesn't want that complexity. It prefers clarity over humanity, control over connection, efficiency over kindness. Some will tell you that emotions are dangerous because they make you biased. And yes, empathy can be imperfect. You might feel more for those who look like you, sound like you, remind you of yourself. But the answer is not to erase empathy. It is to deepen it, to train it, to expand it beyond the familiar. Because logic without empathy doesn't eliminate bias. It just hides it behind equations. It allows people to pretend their decisions are neutral when they are simply callous. It grants moral cover to policies that hurt the most vulnerable, so long as those policies can be defended with data. There is nothing wrong with logic. It is a beautiful tool. It helps you see patterns, solve problems, understand complexity. But it is only half the equation. Without empathy, logic loses its moral compass. It becomes a justification machine for whatever serves those in power. It rationalizes exploitation, inequality, neglect. Because if all you measure is output, you will never see the value of dignity. If all you optimize for is profit, you will never honor the quiet worth of a life that doesn't produce wealth. You were not born to be a calculator. You were born to be a whole person, to feel and to think, to weigh the cold clarity of logic against the warm truth of compassion, to allow your heart to challenge your intellect. When you look at the world and see policies, systems, and decisions that seem efficient but feel wrong, trust that feeling. It is the signal that something human has been lost in the pursuit of rationality. So, before you admire the elegance of a solution, ask what it costs. Before you celebrate the logic of an outcome, ask who it harms. Before you surrender your conscience to a spreadsheet, remember that the greatest atrocities in history were often justified with impeccable logic. A logic that calculated lives as numbers, a logic that claimed to be objective while serving cruelty. You do not have to choose between thinking and feeling. The most courageous acts come from the union of both, from reasoning that is sharpened by empathy, from compassion that is guided by wisdom. Because in the end, a logic without soul is not logic at all. It is a hollow echo of understanding, and you deserve more than that echo. You deserve a way of seeing the world that honors both the mind and the heart. Independence myth, install. You've heard the mantra 1,000 times. Don't rely on anyone. Stand on your own. Dependence is weakness. Independence is power. At first, these words feel invigorating. They promise freedom. They promise that if you are self-sufficient enough, you will never be disappointed. You will never be abandoned. You will never feel the sting of betrayal again. But look closer, and you'll see the cracks in this story. Because often, this fierce independence isn't empowerment. It's a trauma script. It's the armor you built around your heart to survive moments when you reached out and no one came, when you needed comfort and were met with judgment, when you were taught that your needs were too much, that your feelings were a burden. So, you learned to never ask. You learned to never expect. You convinced yourself that the safest way to move through life was alone. You called it strength. You called it maturity. But in truth, it was fear wearing the mask of independence. Think of the child who grows up with unpredictable parents. Maybe love was conditional, given only when they excelled or stayed quiet. Maybe warmth was offered one day and withheld the next. That child discovers early that relying on others is dangerous. They decide it's better to rely on no one at all. They grow up praised for being so responsible, so low maintenance, so strong. But inside, they carry a loneliness they can't name. As adults, they become the people who never ask for help, even when they're drowning. They never share their struggles because they believe vulnerability will cost them love. They build lives that look successful but feel empty. And when relationships crumble, they tell themselves it's proof they were right to stay guarded. This is the independence myth, the idea that needing nothing from anyone is the ultimate proof of strength. But real strength isn't about isolation, it's about connection. It's about knowing when to let someone in, when to admit you can't do everything alone, when to risk disappointment for the chance at closeness. Our culture celebrates the lone wolf. We romanticize self-reliance, imagining it as a path to confidence. But no one tells you that the lone wolf is often alone because it was wounded, because it learned that no pack could be trusted, because it was driven away or left behind. True independence should be the freedom to choose connection, not the compulsion to avoid it. But when you've been hurt, it's hard to tell the difference. You start believing that your inability to rely on others is an asset, something that makes you safe. You tell yourself you don't need anyone. You repeat it like a prayer. But sometimes, what sounds like empowerment is just a strategy to never feel rejected again. Think of the person who never shares their dreams because they're afraid someone will mock them. The person who never lets friends see them cry because they're sure it will drive them away. The person who insists they prefer doing everything alone because asking for help feels like admitting failure. They don't feel strong, they feel numb. And in that numbness, they miss out on the very thing they need most, belonging. You can't experience love without risk. You can't feel intimacy without vulnerability. If you never let your guard down, you might avoid pain. But you also avoid joy. You don't have to prove your worth by carrying everything alone. You don't have to earn love by being invulnerable. You don't have to spend your life performing strength to hide your fear. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is say, I need you. I can't do this by myself. I'm afraid. I'm hurt. I want to be held. And when you say those words, you reclaim something your pain tried to steal. Your right to be human. Your right to be supported. Your right to be loved without conditions. It's easy to believe the independence myth because it spares you from disappointment. If you never rely on anyone, you never have to feel let down. But it also spares you from connection, from softness, from trust. You deserve more than survival. You deserve relationships that hold you when you're tired. You deserve to be cared for when you can't be strong. You deserve the peace that comes when you finally let yourself be known. You are allowed to need people. You are allowed to lean. You are allowed to let someone carry you for a while. And that doesn't make you weak. It makes you whole. Identity as stability bias. We like to believe that identity is a solid thing, a permanent foundation beneath our feet, that if we can just define ourselves clearly enough, we will finally feel stable, finally feel real. But identity isn't a fixed monument. It's a moving target, a story we keep rewriting. Even as we pretend it was etched in stone, the more you cling to a single version of yourself, the more you risk becoming trapped in a cage you built with your own hands. Ask yourself this: who were you 10 years ago? What did you believe was essential about your nature? Maybe you were convinced you were shy, or unworthy, or destined for a specific path. Maybe you defined yourself by your job, your relationship, your family role. But if you look back honestly, you'll see that many of those identities have already dissolved. You've outgrown them, replaced them, forgotten them. And yet, at the time, they felt unshakable. We fear losing identity because we think it's the same as losing ourselves. If I'm not who I thought I was, then who am I? But this fear confuses continuity with integrity. You don't have to remain unchanged to be real. You don't have to cling to every old label to be whole. In fact, the person who refuses to evolve is the one most at risk of losing touch with what's true. Consider how this shows up in careers. Someone spends years calling themselves an artist, or a lawyer, or an entrepreneur. That label becomes a shield and a prison. If they feel drawn to something new, they hesitate. They think, but this isn't who I am. They forget that every identity was once unfamiliar. Every label was once an experiment. The refusal to change is rarely about authenticity. It's about fear. Fear that without a fixed identity, we will be invisible. Even in personal life, identity can be a trap. You might tell yourself, I'm the reliable one, or I'm the funny one, or I'm the caretaker. And at first, these roles feel comforting. They give you a place in the group, but over time, they can suffocate you. Because if you're always the reliable one, you can't ask for help. If you're always the funny one, you can't show your pain. The identity that once kept you safe becomes the reason you can't grow. Think about relationships. How many couples fall apart because they can't let their identities evolve? One person grows, the other clings to an outdated version of them, or they both cling to a shared story that no longer fits. We're the perfect couple, they tell themselves, even as the truth decays underneath. They mistake consistency for love, when love often requires the courage to let each other change. This is why identity feels like stability, but often delivers the opposite, because life will keep transforming you, whether you approve or not. You can resist change, but you can't stop it. You can deny who you're becoming, but you can't reverse it. The longer you pretend to be someone you no longer are, the more disconnected you feel. You start to sense a hollow space between the life you're living and the life you actually want. There's also a cultural pressure to declare your identity and stick to it. Social media rewards the performance of certainty. Profiles and bios and hashtags demand that you summarize yourself in a few tidy words. And once you announce who you are, you feel obligated to defend it. You feel watched. You feel like any deviation will make you look inconsistent. But consistency is not the same as honesty. Sometimes, the most honest thing you can do is admit that you're changing. Even in spiritual or philosophical communities, identity can be a trap. People define themselves by a belief system and then spend years defending it against any evidence that might require revision. They forget that truth is not a possession, it's a pursuit. And if your identity is built on the illusion that you already have all the answers, you will never allow yourself to learn anything new. Ask yourself, who are you when the labels fall away? Who are you when no one is watching? When you don't have to perform your old stories for anyone. That space, unlabeled, undefended, uncertain, is the place where real growth begins. It's uncomfortable. It feels like losing your footing. But maybe that's exactly what you need, because you can't discover who you're becoming while clinging desperately to who you were. This doesn't mean you must reject every label or deny every aspect of yourself. It means you hold identity lightly. You see it as a snapshot, not a contract. You allow it to evolve without shame. You trust that your worth isn't measured by how consistent your story sounds to others. It's measured by how willing you are to keep becoming. So, the next time you feel yourself grasping for a definition, when you feel the panic that comes from not knowing exactly who you are, pause. Remind yourself that stability is not the same as aliveness. You are not a static brand. You are a living process. You are allowed to change your mind, to surprise yourself, to abandon identities that once made sense but no longer fit. Because in the end, clinging to identity for stability is like grabbing a river and trying to make it still. You don't stop the current by holding on. You just exhaust yourself. The river moves anyway. And maybe the point isn't to anchor yourself in the past, but to trust that letting go will carry you somewhere more honest than anything you could have planned. Confidence equals truth error. You've been taught to trust confidence, to look for the people who speak without hesitation, who radiate certainty, who never stumble over their words. You see them on stages, on screens, in boardrooms. They sound like they know exactly what they're doing, like they have cracked to the code you're still trying to decipher. But here's the truth no one likes to admit. Confidence is not the same as truth. In fact, the more someone insists they are right, the more you should wonder what they're trying to hide. This is the confidence equals truth error, the mistake of assuming that certainty is evidence, that the louder someone declares their knowledge, the more reliable that knowledge must be. But look around. History is littered with disasters led by people who were absolutely sure of themselves. Wars waged on false premises. Financial collapses triggered by arrogant predictions. Movements built on the charisma of leaders who sounded like prophets but turned out to be frauds. Think about how many times you've watched someone speak with such authority that you felt your own instincts shrink. Maybe it was a boss who dismissed your concerns with a wave of the hand. Maybe it was a politician who made wild promises in a booming voice. Maybe it was a friend who insisted they knew what was best for you. And maybe, in that moment, You felt the gravitational pull of their certainty. You thought, they must be right. They sound so sure. But confidence is often just performance, a way to hide ignorance behind volume and style. It doesn't take wisdom to look unshakable. It takes practice. It takes a willingness to pretend that doubt is weakness. It takes the belief that appearances matter more than substance. Look closer at the people who impress you most. How many of them ever admit they don't know? How many leave space for questions? How many treat curiosity as strength instead of threat? The ones who do are usually quieter, more measured. They don't need to dominate the room because they are more interested in the truth than in proving they already have it. Our culture rewards the opposite. We love the charismatic expert, the confident leader who promises simple answers to complex problems, the influencer who speaks in absolutes, the entrepreneur who says their product will change everything. We confuse persuasion with understanding. We confuse volume with value. But certainty isn't a sign of insight. It's often a defense against it. Because real insight requires you to admit that you don't have all the answers, that you might be wrong, that the world is too vast, too layered, too mysterious to ever fit neatly into a single narrative. And for many, that humility feels unbearable. So, they build a fortress of confidence. They decorate it with credentials, jargon, and repetition. And then they invite you to step inside and trust them blindly. This doesn't mean all confident people are wrong. Some have earned their certainty through experience and reflection. But if you never see someone wrestle with doubt, you have to wonder whether their certainty is real or just rehearsed. Imagine sitting across from a doctor who tells you there is only one way to treat your illness, and any other opinion is worthless. Imagine hiring a consultant who claims to have the perfect solution without even understanding your problem. Imagine following a leader who insists they alone know the path forward. This is how the confidence equals truth error traps us. It flatters our longing for safety. It tells us we can surrender our questions to someone who sounds like they already have the answers. But wisdom is never that simple. Wisdom requires humility. It requires the ability to say, I don't know yet. It requires respect for complexity. It requires listening as much as speaking. Next time you feel yourself drawn to someone's certainty, pause. Ask yourself whether their confidence is grounded in knowledge or inflated by ego. Listen for the signs. Do they leave space for nuance? Do they acknowledge what they don't know? Do they welcome questions, or do they bristle at any challenge? Real understanding doesn't fear inquiry. Real expertise isn't threatened by uncertainty. And when you feel pressure to perform the same kind of certainty, to pretend you know when you don't, to speak louder so you seem more credible, remember this: you don't have to. You can stand in your own integrity. You can say, I'm not sure yet, and still be worthy of respect. You can choose honesty over performance. You can choose curiosity over pretense. Because in the end, the people who change the world for the better are not always the ones who sound most sure of themselves. They are the ones who are willing to keep learning, the ones who hold their convictions gently enough to update them, the ones who understand that certainty is seductive, but truth is rarely so tidy. So let go of the confidence equals truth error. Let go of the reflex to trust the loudest voice in the room. And remember, sometimes the quietest person is the one who sees most clearly. Sometimes the truest answer is the one that starts with, I don't know. And sometimes the greatest wisdom lives in the space where certainty dares not enter. Self-sufficiency, pride loop. You probably don't remember when you first learned to do everything alone. Maybe it wasn't a single moment. Maybe it was a slow accumulation of small betrayals, disappointments, and silences. A parent who was too overwhelmed to notice your needs. A friend who disappeared when you needed them most. A time you asked for help and were met with cold indifference. So you told yourself it was safer not to rely on anyone. You built an identity around your ability to carry everything alone. You called it strength. You called it self-sufficiency. Over time, it started to feel like something to be proud of. You told yourself that asking was weakness, that needing was weakness, that you would rather break in half than risk the shame of being seen as helpless. This is how the pride loop begins. You start by surviving alone because you have to. Then you keep doing it long after it stops serving you. The survival pattern becomes a philosophy. I don't need anyone. I can handle it all. I'm better off relying only on myself. But if you look closer, you will see that this pride is built on a wound. A wound that says you are only worthy when you are useful. that you are only safe when you never ask for anything, that love is conditional on your ability to never become a burden. Think about how exhausting it is to be your own provider, protector, comforter, and witness all at once. You never let your guard down. You never let the armor slip. Even when you are tired beyond words, you keep performing competence. You keep smiling while you are drowning. You keep telling everyone you're fine because you believe that is the only acceptable answer. It feels powerful to be self-reliant, to be the one everyone else counts on, to never owe anyone anything. But underneath that power is loneliness, a kind of ache that grows in the spaces where trust should live. You watch other people lean on each other, and you tell yourself they are naive. You watch people show their vulnerability, and you call it weakness. But some part of you is starving for that softness you can't allow yourself to have. Consider how much energy it takes to maintain the image of the one-person army. You never let yourself rest. You never allow yourself to collapse. Even your moments of desperation happen in private. You break down behind closed doors, then emerge the next day wearing the same mask. You don't realize that every time you refuse to ask for help, you reinforce the belief that you must do it alone, that you have no other choice. This is the self-sufficiency pride loop. The more you act alone, the more isolated you become. The more isolated you feel, the more you convince yourself that isolation is safer. You begin to believe that no one could possibly understand what you carry, that no one would care if they knew, that your worth is measured by how little you need. But you weren't built to live this way. You weren't designed to be an island. Humans evolved in tribes because connection is survival. Emotional interdependence is as necessary as food and water. You can pretend you don't need it, but that need doesn't go away. It only goes underground, where it festers into resentment and quiet despair. Think of all the times you told yourself you didn't care when someone let you down, all the times you laughed off your loneliness, all the times you swallowed your disappointment because it was easier than admitting you wanted more. You learned to armor your heart so thoroughly that you can't feel it anymore. But here's the truth you've been trying not to face. Independence is only noble when it's a choice, not a compulsion. When you can ask for help and still choose to stand alone, that is strength. But when you can't ask because you believe it makes you unworthy, that is captivity. Real strength is not about doing everything yourself. It is about knowing your limits and trusting others enough to share the load. It is about letting yourself be witnessed in your imperfection. It is about allowing yourself to be human. If you have spent your life proving you don't need anyone, it might be time to ask why. What is the story you are carrying about what happens when you let someone in? What is the fear beneath your pride? What would it mean to allow yourself to be held instead of always holding everything together? You don't have to keep performing self-sufficiency. You don't have to keep proving your worth through endurance. You don't have to keep pretending that you are invulnerable, because the truth is, you are not invulnerable. No one is. The next time you feel the impulse to say, "I've got it," when you really don't, pause. Notice the reflex to protect yourself with pride. Notice the old story whispering that you will be judged or abandoned if you show your need. Then ask yourself, what would happen if I let someone help me? What would happen if I trusted that my worth isn't tied to my usefulness? Maybe you will discover that you are more loved than you realized, that you are allowed to rest, that you are allowed to be held, that you don't have to be a fortress to be respected, because you were never meant to do this alone. You were never meant to carry every burden without relief. You were never meant to be a one-person army. You were meant to belong, to lean, to be seen. And the day you decide to let someone in, not because you are failing, but because you are human, that is the day you will finally know what real strength feels like. Work as purpose program. You were taught from the earliest age that work is not just something you do, it's who you are. That your value, your purpose, your identity all flow from the labor you perform. The message is so pervasive that you hardly notice it. It shows up in the way people introduce themselves by their job titles, as if that encapsulates the whole of a human life. It appears in the way society celebrates overwork, praising exhaustion as a badge of honor. You hear it in slogans that glorify the grind, do what you love, hustle harder, sleep when you're dead. And beneath all of this is a single unspoken premise, that work is sacred. That work will save you. That if you give yourself fully to your labor, you will finally feel complete. But what if that's a lie? What if work is not the cure but the distraction? What if you have been taught to worship labor because it keeps you from noticing the deeper emptiness you carry? Imagine a person who throws themselves into a demanding career. They work 12-hour days, weekends, holidays. They tell themselves that their sacrifices are noble, that their ambition is proof of their worth. And for a while, it feels true. The promotions, the accolades, the pay raises, they all feed the story that this is what life is for. But late at night, when the noise dies down and there are no emails left to answer, a quiet dread seeps in. A suspicion that all this effort is covering something up. A fear that without work, there is nothing left. This is the hidden cost of equating purpose with productivity. You become terrified of stopping, because stopping forces you to feel the void you've been trying to outrun. You see this in the culture of startups, where founders are expected to sacrifice everything: sleep, relationships, health, in service of the company. The narrative is that they are visionaries, driven by passion. But often, what drives them is not passion, but desperation. The desperation to prove they matter. The desperation to silence the voice that wonders whether they would still be worthy if they weren't constantly producing. Work becomes a drug, a way to numb the anxiety, to avoid the discomfort of introspection. You can lose years this way, decades, believing that if you just work a little harder, you will finally arrive somewhere that feels like home. Consider the way retirement is framed in society. People spend their entire lives working, only to discover when they stop that they don't know who they are without their job. They have no hobbies, no relationships that haven't been shaped by work, no sense of identity beyond their professional role. And so, retirement becomes not freedom, but exile, a loss of purpose so profound, it feels like a kind of death. This is what happens when you build your entire sense of self on labor. When you make work the container for all your meaning, you leave yourself nowhere to stand when the work ends. And yet, you are constantly told that this is normal, that this is success. You're told that you should feel grateful to be busy, that idleness is a sign of failure, that boredom is a moral defect. But what if idleness is not the enemy? What if boredom is the doorway to something deeper? Because the truth is, many of the greatest insights, the most profound transformations, happen in the empty spaces, when you are no longer distracted by tasks and deadlines, when you finally have to confront the question you've been avoiding: who am I when I'm not working? What is left when the doing stops? You might feel uneasy even hearing these questions. That's the conditioning talking, the reflex that tells you to reach for your phone, your to-do list, your inbox, anything to fill the space, because the space feels dangerous. It feels like a void, but the void isn't there to punish you. It's there to show you the parts of yourself you have neglected. The dreams you buried because they didn't fit neatly into your career plan. The wounds you ignored because they couldn't be solved with productivity. The longing you silenced because it was easier to stay busy than to feel it fully. Think about how often you meet someone new and ask, "So, what do you do?" As if their job is the most interesting thing about them, as if their humanity is interchangeable with their output. This is how the Work as Purpose program sustains itself, by reducing people to functions, by pretending that labor is the only legitimate source of identity. But you are not a machine. You are not here simply to produce and consume. You are a complex being with needs and gifts that cannot be quantified on a performance review. Of course, work can be meaningful. It can be a way to contribute, to learn, to grow. But when you expect it to satisfy your deepest hunger for purpose, you set yourself up for disappointment, because work is always conditional. Your job will never love you back. Your company will never grieve your absence the way your family or friends might. And no matter how much you give, it will never be enough to fill the spaces inside you that long for something more enduring, something that doesn't depend on productivity. The danger is not in working hard. The danger is in believing that hard work is proof of your worth, that if you just keep striving, you will finally earn the right to exist. This belief is a trap. It keeps you running in circles. It convinces you that rest is indulgence, that reflection is laziness, that your humanity is expendable. And the more you internalize this story, the harder it becomes to imagine any other way to live. So pause, breathe, ask yourself, if I could no longer do this work, who would I be? If I had nothing to prove, how would I spend my time? If my purpose didn't come from labor, where would I find it? These questions are uncomfortable because they lead you back to yourself. to the parts of you that don't care about productivity or status, to the parts that simply want to be, to love, to play, to rest. Maybe you will discover that the void you feared is not a void at all. Maybe it's the space where your true purpose has been waiting all along. Not in the relentless doing, but in the simple, unadorned being. Not in what you produce, but in how you live. Moral compass implant. You grow up believing that your moral compass is something you were born with, that somewhere deep inside, there is a fixed set of values that guide you without question. You call it conscience, integrity, your true north, and you trust it because it feels instinctive. It feels like the purest expression of who you are. But what if that compass isn't as natural as you think? What if the things you believe are right and wrong were planted in you long before you were old enough to question them? From the moment you could understand language, you were surrounded by systems designed to shape your values. Parents rewarding certain behaviors and punishing others. Teachers praising conformity and discouraging defiance. Communities defining goodness in ways that served their own survival. All of it coded into your nervous system before you were even aware it was happening. Imagine a child who learns that telling the truth always leads to punishment. They adapt by becoming skilled at lying. Later in life, they feel shame about their dishonesty. But it's not a moral failing. It's the residue of survival. The compass they developed points away from honesty, not because they lack integrity, but because their environment taught them that truth is dangerous. Think about cultural norms. In some places, loyalty to family is the highest virtue. In others, independence is prized above all. In some communities, speaking up against injustice is a duty. In others, it's seen as betrayal. These moral codes don't arise spontaneously in your heart. They are inherited scripts, passed down through stories, rituals, and the subtle pressure to belong. Even religion, which so many people see as the source of absolute morality, is often absorbed rather than chosen. You adopt the beliefs of your family because that's how you stay safe. You learn which values earn you praise and which ones invite punishment. Over time, those external lessons sink so deep that they feel like your own voice. This doesn't mean your values are fake. It means they are shaped by forces you rarely examine. It means your certainty about right and wrong may be less about objective truth and more about the environment that shaped you. Consider the idea of justice. Some people believe justice means retribution. Others see it as restoration. Which version feels moral to you probably depends on what you were taught to admire. If you grew up watching punishment celebrated, you may feel an instinctive satisfaction when wrongdoers suffer. If you grew up seeing compassion modeled, you may feel that same instinct when people are forgiven. You can feel the power of this programming when you encounter someone whose compass points in a different direction. You might feel disgust, anger, even hatred. It feels like a violation of something sacred. But often, it's just a clash of inherited codes, two scripts that were installed under different conditions. And if you never question those scripts, you risk becoming a puppet of values you didn't choose. You risk defending ideas that harm others simply because they were labeled good before you could think critically. This is why so many conflicts are intractable, because both sides believe their morals are self-evident. Both believe their values are rooted in nature, but in reality, those values are the product of years of reinforcement, reward when you obey, punishment when you deviate. You see this in small ways too. Maybe you feel guilty when you rest because you were taught that productivity is the highest good. Maybe you feel anxious when you set boundaries because you were taught that sacrifice is the proof of love. These aren't innate truths. They are learned responses. It can be terrifying to question your moral compass, because if you admit that your values were installed rather than discovered, you have to decide what you really believe. You have to dismantle the layers of conditioning and ask, does this still serve me? Does this serve others? Is this truly my conviction or just my programming? But that questioning is where freedom begins. You are not bound to the moral code you inherited. You are allowed to revise it. You are allowed to keep what resonates and discard what doesn't. You are allowed to become the author of your own ethics instead of the guardian of someone else's tradition. It takes courage to do this, to look at beliefs that feel as natural as breathing and admit they were taught to you by people who were themselves shaped by fear, culture, and survival. It takes even more courage to decide what you will stand for when you strip away the rewards and the punishments. Your moral compass doesn't have to be a relic of your upbringing. It can be a living system, refined by reflection and compassion. You can hold your values lightly enough to evolve, but firmly enough to guide you. You don't have to reject everything you were taught, but you do have to ask, who benefits if I never question it? Who is served by my unexamined loyalty to ideas I didn't create? Your values feel innate because they were installed early, repeated often, and enforced consistently, but you have the power to reprogram them, to choose a compass that aligns with your conscience, not just your conditioning. And that is where real integrity begins, not in blind adherence, but in conscious choice. Social proof anchor. You think you're independent. You think your opinions are yours alone. But most of what you believe has been shaped, not by evidence, but by other people. Social proof is the anchor you didn't even realize was holding you down. It's the invisible force that makes you trust a belief, simply because you see others trusting it. When everyone else jumps, you feel the urge to jump too. Not because you've weighed the facts, but because mass repetition feels like reality. Imagine you walk into a room and see 10 people staring up at the ceiling. You don't hear a word, but instantly you feel a pull to look up too. Your brain doesn't want to be the outlier. It wants to belong. This reflex is ancient. In our early evolution, agreement meant safety. Disagreement meant exile, and exile often meant death. So, we learn to defer to the crowd, to trade our skepticism for acceptance. Even now, when the stakes are rarely life or death, that old instinct runs the show. Think about trends. A product sells out, and suddenly everyone wants it more. A post goes viral, and suddenly it feels credible. It's not the content that changes, it's the visibility. We call this social proof, the tendency to treat collective enthusiasm as evidence of value. If everyone else approves, it must be good. If everyone else believes, it must be true. But repetition is not evidence. Consensus is not accuracy. It's just an echo getting louder with every voice that joins in. Consider how this shows up in your daily life. You read reviews before you buy anything. You look for likes before you trust an article. You check the follower count before you decide if a creator is worth listening to. And all of this happens so fast, you don't notice the trap. You think you're evaluating quality, but you're really measuring popularity. And popularity can be engineered, it can be purchased, it can be faked. Yet, even when you know that, the illusion doesn't fully fade. This bias is especially dangerous in times of uncertainty. When you're unsure, you look to others for guidance. If everyone else seems confident, you assume they know something you don't. But confidence is contagious, not proof of correctness. A group can be unanimous and still completely wrong. History is full of examples. Financial bubbles, mass hysteria, moral panics. In each case, people surrendered their judgment to the comfort of collective belief. Even in personal decisions, social proof shapes you. Maybe you stayed in a job you hated because everyone around you agreed it was prestigious. Maybe you suppressed doubts about a relationship because all your friends approved. You trusted their certainty over your own intuition. And when you look back, you wonder why you ignored the small voice inside you that whispered something wasn't right. The answer is simple. Belonging felt safer than truth. Social proof is not always toxic. Sometimes it helps us learn quickly. If everyone avoids a path, it could mean danger. If everyone praises a resource, it might be worth your time. But the problem arises when you confuse consensus for validation. When you start believing something because it's easier than standing alone in disagreement. Ask yourself, how many of your beliefs are inherited rather than examined? How many of your choices are echoes of what others expect? Think about the last time you changed your opinion. Was it because you found new evidence, or because you were surrounded by people who all agreed on something else? Did you shift because you discovered a deeper truth, or because the silence of standing alone was too loud to bear? Look at social media. Platforms are engineered to amplify social proof. Likes, shares, views, these metrics are designed to trigger your ancient need to conform. The more engagement something has, the more credible it feels. But the algorithm doesn't care about accuracy. It cares about attention. It rewards outrage, novelty, spectacle. And when enough people engage, the spectacle becomes reality, at least in perception. You might think you're immune. You might think you're too smart to be swayed by the herd. But intelligence doesn't inoculate you against social proof. If anything, it can make you better at rationalizing why the majority must be correct. You find clever arguments to defend what is really just an emotional reflex to belong. You don't call it conformity. You call it consensus. You don't call it fear. You call it pragmatism. The antidote to social proof isn't isolation. It's awareness. It's learning to pause when you feel the pull of the crowd. It's asking yourself, would I still believe this if no one else did? It's the courage to stand in the quiet space between your own convictions and everyone else's expectations. That space feels uncomfortable because it is free of anchors, but sometimes the absence of anchors is the only way to see clearly. So the next time you feel sure about something simply because everyone around you seems sure, step back. Look for evidence beyond repetition. Look for clarity beyond confidence. Because truth doesn't require an audience to be true. And when the crowd jumps, you don't have to follow. You can stand still. You can look deeper. You can decide for yourself what deserves your belief. Balance as virtue trap. You're told your entire life that balance is a virtue, that if you can just hold everything in perfect proportion, your work and your relationships, your ambition and your rest, your certainty and your curiosity, you will finally feel whole. You hear it in motivational speeches, in glossy magazine articles, in the polite advice of people who mean well. Find balance. Be balanced. But nobody tells you that balance isn't always good. Sometimes, balance is just a prettier name for fear. Sometimes, it's indecision wrapped in perfectionist clothing. Think about the times you told yourself you were being balanced when, really, you were just afraid to commit. You stayed halfway in a relationship because leaving was terrifying, but staying fully felt like surrender. You kept one foot in a career you'd outgrown because letting go of the identity was too painful. You hovered in the middle of every choice, convinced that moderation was wisdom. And sometimes it was. But often, it was paralysis. You called it balance because it sounded noble, because it made you look measured instead of stuck. Balance becomes a trap when it's less about harmony and more about avoidance. When it's the story you tell yourself so you don't have to take a side, risk judgment, or face the cost of an authentic decision. When you think you're being wise by weighing all options endlessly, but really you're just circling the same fears over and over. Indecision doesn't become virtue simply because you call it balance. Our culture loves this trap because it looks so elegant. A balanced person appears reasonable. They never seem too emotional, too certain, too radical. They're easier to accept, easier to applaud. But ask yourself, who benefits when you stay in that carefully arranged middle? Who profits from you never taking a stand? Who is comforted when you dilute your conviction in the name of balance? Consider how often you've heard that you should balance self-care with self-sacrifice, that you should balance ambition with contentment, that you should balance skepticism with faith. All of these can be useful ideas until they become cages. Because sometimes your life needs more than balance. Sometimes it needs a bold decision. A declaration, a risk. Imagine a person who stays in a toxic relationship because they believe balance means compromising. Imagine an employee who never challenges a harmful policy because they think balance means keeping the peace. Imagine a creative person who waters down their work so it appeals to everyone until it says nothing at all. That's not balance, that's self-abandonment. Balance as a virtue can even mask perfectionism. The idea that you must get every variable exactly right before you move, that you must wait until you are perfectly prepared, perfectly informed, perfectly poised. But life doesn't care about your perfect equilibrium. It demands movement. It demands that you choose, even when your choice is messy or unpopular. True balance is dynamic. It shifts. It requires you to stay responsive to what is actually happening, not just what looks correct from the outside. Sometimes that means leaning hard in one direction because that's what the moment calls for. Sometimes it means letting go of the illusion that you can keep everyone comfortable while still being true to yourself. Ask yourself where in your life you are using balance as an excuse, where you are telling yourself you're being careful when you're really just scared, where you are calling your hesitation prudence when it's actually self-doubt, where you are confusing being agreeable with being in integrity. This doesn't mean all balance is bad. Balance can be beautiful when it emerges naturally, when it's the result of listening deeply to yourself, not the performance of looking moderate. It can be powerful when it comes from wholeness, not from fear of extremes. But you have to be honest about your motives. You have to ask whether your balance is serving you or suffocating you, whether it's a sign of your maturity or your reluctance to live fully, because sometimes The bravest thing you can do is to step out of the middle and let yourself lean hard into what matters. Maybe that means leaving something behind that no longer fits, even if it makes you look reckless. Maybe it means speaking a truth that breaks the illusion of neutrality. Maybe it means finally admitting that you don't want to balance everything, that you want to choose. Balance looks safe. It looks admirable. But it can be the most seductive form of self-betrayal if you never question it, because life isn't always tidy. It won't always let you keep every option open. It will ask you, again and again, to show your hand, to decide. So be cautious of the balance as virtue trap. Be wary of the comfort it offers, because comfort isn't always clarity, and moderation isn't always wisdom. Sometimes, the most honest thing you can do is to stop pretending you can stay in the middle forever, and to let yourself finally, imperfectly, pick a side. Vulnerability is currency. You are told that vulnerability is a virtue, that sharing your struggles is the key to connection, to belonging, to real intimacy. You see it everywhere, on stages, in interviews, across your social feeds. People cracking open their lives, exposing their wounds, confessing the hidden mess behind the curated surface. It feels refreshing, honest, brave. And sometimes it is, but not always. Because in a culture that rewards authenticity, even vulnerability can become a kind of currency, a performance you stage to prove your depth. A carefully chosen story you offer up, not to connect, but to be admired for how unflinching you are about your own pain. Think about the last time you shared something raw. Maybe it was online, where thousands of strangers could watch. Maybe it was in a circle of colleagues, or at a gathering where everyone was expected to be real. Did you feel a quiet thrill when you spoke? Did you notice the way people leaned in, the way their faces softened with recognition? Did you feel special for being the one who dared to go there? There is nothing wrong with wanting to be seen. It is a human impulse, but there is a difference between sharing to be known and sharing to be celebrated for how brave you appear. That difference is subtle, but it matters, because when vulnerability becomes performance, it loses the very thing that makes it meaningful. Real vulnerability is uncomfortable. It isn't curated or clean. It doesn't always end in applause. Sometimes it leaves you feeling raw, exposed, uncertain if you did the right thing. It is the trembling voice, the awkward pause, the admission you can barely say out loud. It is the risk that your honesty will not be met with understanding, that the person listening will turn away, or weaponize your confession, or simply not care. But performative vulnerability is different. It is tidy. It is polished. It is designed to create impact without real risk. You share the heartbreak that is safely in the past, the trauma you have already processed, the flaw you can frame as a lesson. You cry on cue, but only enough to be moving, never so much that you lose control. You curate your brokenness into a story with a redemptive arc. And when the audience claps, you feel validated. Not necessarily because you were understood, but because you were compelling. This is why you have to be honest with yourself about your motives. Are you sharing because your heart needs to be witnessed? Because you are ready to let someone into the places you still don't fully understand? Or are you sharing because you know vulnerability is the fastest way to be admired in a culture obsessed with authenticity? Consider the way social media has trained us to display our wounds. A perfectly lit photo with a caption about anxiety. A video where you detail your insecurities, but you never show the parts of you that are still unresolved. You reveal just enough to look relatable, but never so much that it costs you your image. This is not always conscious. You may genuinely believe you are being open, but if you look closely, you will see the choreography, the careful calculations of what to say and what to hold back, so you can appear raw without actually feeling too exposed. And it's not just online. Even in our personal relationships, vulnerability can be transactional. You tell someone a carefully chosen story so they will trust you. You confess something intimate so they feel obligated to reciprocate. You create a sense of closeness, but it is built on performance rather than truth. None of this means you shouldn't share your struggles. None of it means vulnerability is inherently false. But it does mean you need to ask yourself over and over, why am I doing this? What am I hoping to get? What part of me is trying to be seen? And what part of me is hiding behind the performance? Real vulnerability requires surrender. It means letting go of the outcome. It means risking rejection, misunderstanding, or indifference. It means being willing to reveal the parts of yourself that you can't yet package into a neat story. The parts that don't resolve cleanly, the feelings that still feel too big or too messy. If you are always sharing from a place of certainty, always presenting your wounds as lessons learned, always framing your pain as a badge of courage, ask yourself if you are performing. Ask yourself if you are trading your humanity for approval. Because here is the paradox. The more you curate your openness, the less real it becomes. The more you treat your pain as content, the harder it is to feel genuinely connected. You might get applause, you might get sympathy, but deep down, you will know that the person they are clapping for is a character you created. There is nothing wrong with wanting to be understood, nothing wrong with wanting to be seen as real, but you have to be honest about the cost. When you turn vulnerability into currency, you lose something essential. You lose the sacredness of true confession, the quiet, private courage it takes to tell the truth without needing it to be impressive. You were not built to be a brand. Your heart was not meant to be a marketing tool. Your pain does not have to be aesthetic. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is to keep something for yourself, to let your story stay unfinished, to allow your wounds to heal in the dark where no one is watching. So, the next time you feel the urge to share, pause. Ask yourself, is this for connection or for validation? Am I willing to be misunderstood? Am I ready for the quiet after the confession when no one claps and no one rushes to tell me how brave I am? That is where real intimacy begins, in the spaces where performance falls away, in the moments when you are no longer curating your pain, but simply allowing it to be witnessed. That is the place where your vulnerability stops being currency and starts being truth. And that is the place where you are finally, fully human. Realism, defense mechanism. You've heard it. Maybe you've said it yourself. I'm just being realistic. Those words feel noble, grounded, as if you're the only one brave enough to see the world as it is. You call yourself a realist because it sounds better than calling yourself a pessimist, because it sounds like wisdom instead of fear. But realism, when used as a shield, is often nothing more than disguised self-protection, a clever way to avoid the risk of hope, a convenient excuse to reject possibilities before life has the chance to disappoint you. You convince yourself that by expecting the worst, you're preparing, that by forecasting failure, you're staying safe. But you're not safe. You're simply smaller, more cautious, less alive. Imagine someone who dreams of starting a business. Before they've even drafted a plan, they tell themselves it probably won't work. The market is saturated, the economy is unstable, they don't have the right connections. They list every reason why it will fail. They call this analysis, due diligence, realism. But beneath all the logic is something simpler, fear. The fear of being exposed as inadequate, the fear of investing their heart and watching it break. The fear that success might demand more vulnerability than they can bear. So, they preemptively declare defeat and call it realism. They fold before the first hand is dealt. They mistake their dread for evidence. You see this same pattern in relationships. Someone who has been hurt too many times becomes an expert in predicting betrayal. Every partner is scrutinized, every kindness second-guessed. When friends encourage them to be open, they say, "I'm just being realistic. People always leave." But is that realism, or is it a wound masquerading as wisdom? Is it accuracy, or is it a reflex to avoid getting close again? Because when you declare that something will fail before it even begins, you never have to face the risk of being proven wrong. You never have to feel the sting of disappointment. But you also never get to feel the joy of being surprised. This is the trap. When you live behind the realism defense mechanism, you believe you are shielding yourself from pain. But in truth, you're guaranteeing a different kind of pain, a slow erosion of wonder, of curiosity, of hope. You become the person who shoots down every possibility with the same tired bullet. That's not realistic. You think you're sparing yourself, but you're only shrinking your life to the size of your fear. Consider how this mindset shows up in creative pursuits. An artist who never finishes a painting because they already know it won't be good enough. A writer who abandons drafts because the odds of publishing are slim. A musician who never records a song because the industry is too competitive. They each have 1,000 reasons to stop, and all of them sound reasonable, realistic. But realism can become a form of paralysis, a way to rationalize inaction, a way to avoid the raw, necessary risk that creation demands. Because the truth is, every worthwhile endeavor is unrealistic until it isn't. Every dream is improbable until someone has the audacity to try. You might think that by expecting the worst, you're being mature, that optimism is naive, that hope is a luxury you can't afford. But look closer and you'll see that your realism is selective. It doesn't forecast every outcome, only the ones that confirm your fear. It doesn't account for the countless ways things could work out. It doesn't include the possibility that you might be stronger than you imagine, or that life might surprise you with an opportunity you never saw coming. Realism without openness is just cynicism dressed up in a nicer suit. Think about how children approach the world. They don't call themselves realists. They don't assume that every risk ends in disaster. They are wired to explore, to attempt, to believe in possibilities. They haven't yet learned to dull their instincts with elaborate justifications for why nothing will work. Over time, experience teaches caution, and caution is valuable. But when caution calcifies into chronic pessimism, you lose something essential. You lose your capacity to dream without apology. You lose your willingness to be surprised. You lose the part of yourself that can stand in the face of uncertainty and still say, maybe. There is a difference between grounded awareness and self-sabotage. Real awareness acknowledges risk, but doesn't preclude action. It sees obstacles but doesn't declare them insurmountable. It balances hope with discernment. The realism defense mechanism, on the other hand, is designed to keep you inactive. It whispers that your dreams are childish, your desires impractical, your optimism embarrassing. It convinces you that settling is maturity, that lowering your standards is the responsible thing to do. But settling is not maturity. It is surrender, and you deserve better than surrender disguised as wisdom. Ask yourself, how many times have you called something unrealistic simply because it required more courage than you were willing to muster? How often have you dismissed possibilities because you couldn't bear the thought of trying and failing? How many times have you silenced your own curiosity with the phrase, "Be realistic"? These questions are uncomfortable because they reveal what realism often conceals: your fear of vulnerability. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is the birthplace of every meaningful experience. To love, to create, to grow. These things all require a willingness to risk disappointment. When you use realism as a shield, you protect yourself from that risk. But you also protect yourself from the possibility of transformation, from the chance to discover that you are more resilient than you thought, from the moments of grace that only reveal themselves to those brave enough to try. So the next time you feel the impulse to dismiss a hope, a dream, a desire as unrealistic, pause. Ask yourself, is this truly about accuracy? Or is it about fear? Am I protecting myself from failure, or am I protecting myself from life itself? Because life is inherently unrealistic. It is messy and unpredictable and often astonishing. And if you insist on only pursuing what feels safe, you will spend your days in a small, dim room of your own making. You are capable of more than perpetual caution. You are worthy of dreams that stretch the limits of your imagination. You deserve a life that is bigger than your defenses. So, step out from behind the realism that keeps you numb. Take a chance on something uncertain. Let yourself want what you want without apology, because the truth is, the most realistic thing you can do is to live fully, even when you are afraid. Story equals truth fallacy. Humans are storytelling creatures. From the moment you learn to speak, you start weaving narratives about who you are, what happened to you, and why it matters. Stories give your life structure. They turn random events into arcs, chaos into meaning. But just because a story feels true doesn't mean it is. Your mind edits the messiness of reality to make something coherent, something you can live with. And in that editing, the truth often gets replaced by something simpler and more comfortable. Think about how you explain your past. Maybe you tell yourself you were always the outsider, never understood. Or you believe you were the peacemaker, the one who held everything together. These stories are comforting because they create order. They give you a clear identity, but look closer, and you'll see the contradictions you had to erase. The times you did belong, the moments you caused conflict, the parts that don't fit the narrative you've chosen. You might think of your memories as objective records, but they're more like highlight reels edited by an anxious director who wants the story to make sense. Your mind deletes scenes, rewrites dialogue, adds music to the background, And over time, you start believing this version is the whole truth. Consider how this plays out in relationships. When a connection ends, you often craft a story about why. Maybe they were the villain. Maybe you were. Maybe it was doomed from the start. But reality is usually more complicated. It's a mix of good intentions and failures, love and fear. And yet, you flatten it into a narrative you can carry without too much pain. You tell it to your friends, you tell it to yourself, until the rough edges disappear. This doesn't mean you're lying. It means you're human. Your brain craves simplicity. It wants clear cause and effect. It wants heroes and villains, beginnings and endings. But life doesn't work that way. Life is made of contradictions that never resolve. Even your sense of self is a story. You think you are one consistent character, moving through time with purpose. But if you look back honestly, you'll see how much you've changed, how often you've betrayed your own values, surprised yourself, evolved without noticing. Still, you stitch all those selves together into a single narrative so you don't have to feel fractured. Stories are powerful. They can inspire, heal, and connect us. But they can also limit us. When you cling too tightly to a story, you stop seeing what doesn't fit. You ignore evidence that challenges your conclusions. You reject complexity because it threatens your sense of identity. Think about the stories you tell about your failures. Maybe you believe you're cursed, or incompetent, or always overlooked. That story protects you from the discomfort of uncertainty. If you're cursed, you don't have to try again. If you're incompetent, you don't have to risk hope. But those stories aren't the truth. They're defenses. Or consider the narratives you build around your successes. You might tell yourself you earned everything through hard work alone, leaving out the luck, privilege, and help that made it possible. That story keeps you proud, but it also keeps you blind. Even collective stories can distort reality. Nations tell myths about their greatness and innocence, leaving out the violence and injustice woven into their history. Families pass down tales about loyalty and sacrifice, ignoring the secrets and betrayals. We agree to these stories because they make us feel safe and righteous. But real truth doesn't care about your comfort. It doesn't care if the contradictions make you uneasy. Truth is messy, unresolved, sometimes painful. If you want to see it, you have to be willing to let your stories fall apart. You have to ask, what am I leaving out to keep this narrative intact? What parts of myself have I silenced to fit this plot? What if there is no single explanation, no simple arc? It takes courage to admit your stories are partial, to look at your life without the edits and see the chaos in all its raw honesty. But in that chaos, there is freedom. Because when you stop pretending your story is the truth, you can finally make room for growth. You can question your assumptions. You can forgive yourself for being inconsistent. Your stories will always be with you. They are how you make sense of being alive. But you don't have to let them become cages. You can hold them lightly, knowing they are only versions of reality, not reality itself. When you remember that, you can meet life as it is, not as you wish it were. You can embrace the contradictions. You can tell new stories when the old ones stop serving you. And maybe that is the truest thing of all, that no story is final. No narrative can ever contain the full complexity of who you are, and you don't have to pretend it can. Productivity, self-worth. Link. You probably don't remember the first time you learned that being busy made you valuable. Maybe it was when you were a child, praised for every task you completed. Maybe it was when you saw your parents measure their worth by how much they achieved. Or maybe it was simply the culture around you, whispering that a full schedule is a moral victory. But somewhere along the way, you absorb the message. Productivity is proof that you matter. And when you're still, when you pause, when you dare to rest, a small voice inside you asks, "What am I worth now?" This link between busyness and self-worth is so pervasive you rarely see it for what it is: conditioning. It's the slow drip of praise for overwork and the silent punishment of stillness. It's why you feel a surge of pride when you cross off your to-do list, and why an empty calendar feels like failure. You've been taught to equate output with virtue. If you're busy, you're good. If you're not, you're disposable. Think about how often you brag about exhaustion. How many conversations start with how tired you are, how many hours you worked, how little you slept. We wear burnout like a badge. We admire the person who never stops, who answers emails at midnight, who sacrifices weekends for deadlines. But this admiration is a trap. It keeps you tethered to the belief that rest is laziness, and that your value depends on your utility. Ask yourself, who benefits from this belief? Who gains when you measure your worth by how much you produce? Employers, corporations, systems that see you as a resource to be optimized. If you constantly hustle to prove you matter, you never pause long enough to question whether the game is rigged. You never ask whether all this striving is creating the life you want, or just the life you were told to want. This conditioning is so deep that even leisure becomes another form of productivity. You don't just rest, you optimize your rest. You track your sleep, schedule your hobbies, measure your self-care, and if your relaxation isn't efficient, you feel like you're failing at that too. Stillness doesn't feel like freedom, it feels like a threat to the identity you've built around being indispensable. Consider what happens when you can't be productive. When illness, grief, or burnout forces you to stop. You don't just lose your routine, you lose your sense of self. You wonder, who am I if I'm not achieving? This question is painful because you've been taught that your worth lives in what you do, not who you are. And when the doing stops, you fear that you disappear. But the truth is, your value has never depended on your output. You are not a machine designed to convert time into profit. You are a human being whose worth is inherent. The problem is, you don't feel that truth because it has been buried under years of conditioning. It takes conscious effort to unlearn it, to practice believing that rest is not a defect. That being is enough. Think about nature. A tree doesn't earn its place by how many leaves it produces. It doesn't panic when winter strips it bare. It doesn't question its right to exist when it stops growing for a season. It simply is. And its value doesn't diminish because it's dormant. You are allowed to be the same. You are allowed to have seasons. You are allowed to slow down, to be still, to trust that you are worthy even when you produce nothing. This doesn't mean productivity is bad. Creating, building, contributing, these can be beautiful expressions of your gifts, but they are not the source of your worth. They are not the only reason you deserve love, respect, belonging. When you believe they are, you become enslaved to your own ambition. You can never rest because rest feels like disappearing. Ask yourself what you fear will happen if you stop proving yourself, if you set down your tasks and simply exist. Do you imagine people will forget you? Do you think you'll be exposed as unremarkable? Do you believe you'll lose everything you've earned? These fears are not facts. They are echoes of a culture that profits from your perpetual striving. Freedom begins the moment you question these fears. When you notice the urge to overwork, pause. When you feel shame for resting, ask whose voice you're hearing. Oh, when you catch yourself measuring your day by output alone, remember that you are not here just to be useful. You are here to be alive. So the next time you feel compelled to prove your worth through busyness, take a breath. Notice the conditioning. Notice how it wants you to trade your peace for a fleeting sense of value. And then, if you can, choose differently. Choose to believe that you are enough without the endless doing. That your existence is not a problem to be solved by productivity. That stillness is not failure. It is the quiet space where you remember who you are beyond all the roles, all the achievements, all the striving. You are worthy, even when you are still. Intelligence equals awareness. Fallacy. You've probably met someone whose intelligence left you in awe. Maybe it was their vocabulary, the way they could dissect an argument, the speed with which they solved problems others couldn't even see. They seemed luminous, untouchable, so sharp that you trusted them almost without question. You thought, if anyone understands the world, it's them. But intelligence doesn't guarantee awareness. In fact, sometimes brilliance in thought can blind the heart. This is the intelligence equals awareness fallacy. The mistaken belief that a high IQ means a wide perspective, that cleverness automatically comes with wisdom, that smart people can't be ignorant or unkind. Think about it. How many times have you seen someone with a brilliant mind use it to justify cruelty, to rationalize arrogance, to dismiss the feelings of others because they couldn't be quantified or proven? Intelligence is a tool, a powerful one, but it can also be a weapon. When you learn to argue better than everyone else, it becomes easy to believe you are always right. When you can see patterns others miss, it becomes tempting to believe your perceptions are complete. But no amount of intellectual capacity can replace humility. No brilliance of mind can substitute for the quiet work of listening. Imagine a gifted surgeon who saves lives in the operating room but treats the nurses with contempt. Or a philosopher whose ideas have transformed entire fields, but who can't have a single honest conversation with their own family, or a CEO whose strategic vision built an empire, but whose employees are terrified to speak up. You can be intelligent enough to reshape industries and still be oblivious to your own blind spots. You can have a genius-level mind and a stunted heart. Our culture feeds this fallacy because we love the myth of the all-seeing intellect. We celebrate child prodigies, quote famous thinkers, elevate experts to near oracle status. We imagine that if someone is smart enough, they must also be wise enough to lead us. But awareness isn't an automatic upgrade that comes with intelligence. Awareness is something you cultivate through intention, through humility, through the uncomfortable practice of questioning your own brilliance. Real awareness isn't just knowing more facts. It's recognizing that facts are never the whole story. It's understanding that your mind is a lens, not a mirror. That every perspective, no matter how well-reasoned, is partial. And that intelligence is often most dangerous when it convinces you that you've outgrown the need to learn. Look closely at your own life. How many times have you used cleverness to defend yourself when you were actually afraid? How many times have you weaponized logic to avoid vulnerability? How many times have you convinced yourself you were right simply because you could argue better than the person in front of you? This is the shadow side of intelligence. It makes it easy to outthink empathy, to build an airtight case for why you don't have to feel what others feel, to rationalize your own blind spots until they seem like strengths. If you want proof, look at the history of the world. Some of the most destructive ideas came from highly intelligent people who never questioned their assumptions. Brilliant minds built theories to justify oppression. Brilliant strategists designed weapons that could end civilization. Brilliant economists created systems that enriched the few and starved the many. Intelligence alone doesn't guarantee that you'll see clearly. It only guarantees that you'll see cleverly. Awareness, on the other hand, is slow work. It requires you to step outside the glow of your own thoughts and look honestly at the impact you have on others. It demands that you hold space for feelings you can't analyze into submission, that you allow uncertainty to humble you, that you remember every mind, no matter how brilliant, is shaped by hidden biases. Next time you find yourself trusting someone's intelligence over your own intuition, pause. Ask yourself whether their certainty is insight or simply confidence, whether their cleverness is helping or just intimidating. And next time you catch yourself dismissing someone because they can't keep up with your ideas, consider what you might be missing in their experience. Because the most important truths are often the ones that can't be diagrammed on a whiteboard. The truths about love, suffering, joy, grief, these are felt before they are understood. And no amount of intellectual sophistication can replace the raw, honest work of feeling. You don't have to choose between thinking and feeling. You can honor both. You can use your intelligence to illuminate, not to dominate, to connect, not to isolate. But that requires self-awareness. It requires you to notice when your brilliance becomes a shield. It requires you to remember that intelligence doesn't absolve you from empathy. It obligates you to practice it more deliberately. So let go of the intelligence equals awareness fallacy. Let go of the comforting illusion that smart people see everything. Remember that awareness isn't measured by your IQ, but by your willingness to stay teachable, to stay open, to be humbled by the complexity of being human. Because in the end, it won't be the sharpest mind that makes you wise. It will be the mind that has the courage to admit it doesn't know everything, and the heart that's willing to learn what the mind can't grasp. Consistency as morality. You are told that consistency is a virtue, that it is a sign of integrity to always think the same way, to act the same way, to declare the same beliefs over time. You are praised for it. People admire your unwavering stance, your predictable opinions, your refusal to bend, and you start to believe that this is what makes you trustworthy, that your sameness is proof of your worth. But if you look closer, you will see that sometimes consistency is not a sign of strength. Sometimes it is just fear in disguise. Imagine you are 16. You believe the world is simple. You inherit ideas from your family, your culture, your friends. You don't question them because you don't know how. You declare your opinions with certainty. You say, this is right and that is wrong. You draw bright lines between good people and bad ones. You call it clarity. But maybe it is just a lack of experience. Then you get older. You encounter people who live differently. You learn stories that don't fit into your categories. You see that Life is not as binary as you were taught. You start to feel something shift inside you, a quiet discomfort with the old beliefs you once defended. And this is where the tension begins. Because you have been told that changing your mind is weakness, that admitting you were wrong makes you a hypocrite, so you dig in. You keep repeating the same ideas even when they no longer feel true. This is the prison of consistency, the performance of certainty that leaves no room for growth. You start to mistake repetition for integrity. You forget that wisdom often requires revision. Think about how many times you have judged someone for contradicting themselves. A public figure who said one thing 10 years ago and something different today. A friend who changed their politics. A family member who let go of an old dogma. You probably called them inconsistent. Maybe you felt superior for being steadfast. But what if their so-called inconsistency was actually evidence of courage? What if it was a sign that they were willing to let go of certainty to learn something new? This system that worships consistency has a hidden agenda. If you believe you must never change your mind, you become easy to control. You cling to the first ideas you were given. You defend them even when they stop making sense. You police your own curiosity because you are afraid of being called a hypocrite. But the truth is, only dead things never change. Growth requires contradiction. Awakening requires admitting that you were once asleep. And evolution always looks inconsistent from the outside. Think about your own life. The person you were 5 years ago might be unrecognizable to you now. You may have believed things that embarrass you. You may have acted in ways you regret. But isn't that the point of being alive? To allow experience to transform you? To let new evidence rearrange your convictions? If you are never willing to contradict your former self, you are not practicing integrity. You are practicing self-preservation. You are clinging to a version of you that no longer exists. Real integrity is not about staying the same. It is about telling the truth about who you are now, even if it contradicts who you were then. It is about standing in the discomfort of change without needing to apologize for it. Consider how this plays out in public discourse. When someone grows, we call them fake. When they admit past ignorance, we say they are pandering. When they apologize for old harm, we dismiss it as performative. We create a culture where people are too afraid to evolve because evolution will be used against them. But the alternative is worse. A world where no one ever changes their mind. A world where people double down on harmful ideas because to let them go would mean admitting they were wrong. That is not integrity, that is cowardice wrapped in the language of principle. So the next time you feel the impulse to celebrate your consistency, pause. Ask yourself, am I staying the same because it feels true or because it feels safe? What would happen if I let myself change? What would happen if I stopped performing certainty and allowed my convictions to be porous? You might discover that the parts of you were trying so hard to protect no longer fit, that the ideas you have built your identity around are too small for the person you are becoming. And maybe, if you can find the courage to let go of the illusion that consistency is morality, you will discover something more honest, a way of being that is fluid, responsive, alive. You were not meant to be static. You were not meant to be a monument to your younger self. You were meant to grow, to contradict, to evolve. So, when someone calls you inconsistent, take a breath. Remember that changing your mind does not make you a hypocrite. It makes you a student. It means you are paying attention. It means you are willing to let your experiences shape you instead of pretending you have always been complete. And that is not something to be ashamed of. That is something to be proud of. Because it takes far more courage to let yourself be transformed than it does to stay the same. Forgiveness as obligation. You've heard it your whole life. You must forgive to heal. You're told that forgiveness is the only path to peace, that carrying anger will poison you from the inside. The message sounds compassionate, noble. But what if it's not always true? What if forgiveness, when demanded instead of freely chosen, becomes something corrosive? A leash you hand to those who hurt you, letting them tug on your dignity whenever they please. This is the lie buried beneath the mantra of automatic forgiveness, that everyone deserves your mercy no matter what they did, that your moral worth is measured by how quickly you can swallow your pain and pretend nothing happened. But real healing is not found in compulsory absolution. Real healing begins when you allow yourself to feel the fullness of your anger without shame. Imagine someone who was betrayed by a partner they trusted completely. Friends and family rush to say, You have to forgive. Otherwise, you'll never move on. But what does that really mean? Often it means you should skip past the grief, the rage, the shattering of your sense of safety. You're expected to bypass the messy reality of your own heartbreak in favor of a neat narrative. You've forgiven, so you are healed. But life doesn't work that way. You can't rush the process of recovery just to satisfy someone else's discomfort with your pain. Sometimes, forgiveness is a way to erase accountability. It becomes a polite curtain draped over someone else's cruelty. Your urge to let go because holding on is negative, because resentment is toxic, because anger makes other people uncomfortable. But anger is not always a sickness to be cured. Sometimes, it's the most honest evidence that you were wronged. It's the part of you that refuses to accept what happened as acceptable. When you're pressured to forgive before you're ready, you're being asked to invalidate that part of yourself, to betray your own sense of justice. Consider the child who grows up in an abusive home. As an adult, they're told that they have to forgive their parent to be free. They are told that without forgiveness, they are doomed to live in the past. But sometimes, the past won't leave you alone simply because you've decided to forgive it. Sometimes, the wound requires more than a declaration. It requires space to feel, to rage, to grieve. The obligation to forgive can become just another form of control, another way the abuser's influence seeps into the present. It's as if you are being asked to do the emotional labor of absolving someone who never did the work to deserve absolution. You see this dynamic in broader society too. In the aftermath of injustice, communities are told to forgive their oppressors in the name of unity and reconciliation. But unity without accountability is just erasure. Reconciliation without truth is just denial. When forgiveness is demanded instead of earned, it becomes an instrument to protect the status quo, to silence rightful anger, to avoid the discomfort of collective responsibility. It turns forgiveness into a performance rather than an authentic choice. There is nothing inherently wrong with forgiveness. When it arises organically, when you have processed your pain and genuinely feel ready to release the hold it has on you, it can be liberating. But real forgiveness is not something you do for others. It is something you do for yourself, on your timeline, in your own way. It cannot be forced or faked. It cannot be used as proof of your goodness or your strength. When forgiveness is used as a yardstick to measure your worth, it becomes just another prison. You might feel pressure to prove that you've moved on, to show that you are better than the person who harmed you, to be the bigger person. But sometimes, being the bigger person is simply acknowledging that you are not ready to forgive, that your anger still has something to teach you, that your boundaries are more important than other people's expectations. This does not make you bitter. It makes you honest. Think about how often forgiveness is framed as the final step in the healing process, as if everything before it is just a prelude. But healing is not linear. It does not follow a script. You don't have to forgive to heal. You don't have to absolve to reclaim your power. Sometimes, healing means accepting that you will never get an apology. Sometimes, it means deciding that the person who hurt you no longer gets any place in your heart, not even as the recipient of your mercy. That, too, is a form of freedom. You are allowed to hold your pain with compassion, instead of rushing to extinguish it. You are allowed to acknowledge that some harm is unforgivable, not because you are weak or vindictive, but because you honor your own worth too much to pretend otherwise. You are allowed to heal on your own terms. Forgiveness, when it is real, is never an obligation. It is not a transaction or a virtue signal. It is not something you owe to the person who wounded you. It is a choice, one that can only come when you have felt every feeling that needs to be felt, when you have grieved every loss that needs to be grieved, when you have rebuilt yourself from the inside out. And if that day never comes, it doesn't mean you are broken. It doesn't mean you are doomed to bitterness. It simply means you are honest about what happened to you and about what you can and cannot offer in response. So, the next time someone tells you that you must forgive to heal, pause. Ask yourself, is this true for me? Or is this what they need to believe so they can feel comfortable? Are they asking me to forgive because it will help me, or because it will make them feel better about the world? Because the truth is, you don't owe anyone the performance of absolution. You don't have to release someone who never showed remorse. You don't have to pretend your pain has vanished. Healing is yours to define, yours to claim. And sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is to refuse to forgive before your heart is ready. Humility, performance loop. You've been taught that humility is a virtue, that shrinking yourself is a sign of goodness, that downplaying your abilities proves you are noble. From childhood, you learn to keep your head down, not to appear arrogant, never to celebrate your own power too openly. And so, you develop the habit of acting small, of deflecting compliments, of pretending you don't see your own strength. At first, it feels virtuous. It feels like modesty, like you are protecting yourself from pride. But look closer and you'll see how often this humility is just fear in disguise. You aren't downplaying yourself because you're enlightened. You're doing it because you're terrified of what might happen if you stepped fully into who you are. Think about how you respond when someone recognizes your talent. Maybe you laugh it off. Maybe you insist it was luck. Maybe you list all the ways you could have done better. You tell yourself this is humility, but often it's just a performance, a ritual to keep you small so you don't risk criticism or envy. Consider how you feel when you imagine owning your accomplishments without apology. Does it make you uncomfortable? Does it feel like arrogance? That discomfort isn't proof you're humble. It's proof you've been conditioned to see self-recognition as a threat. This is the humility performance loop. You diminish yourself to appear good. You hide your gifts so no one will accuse you of thinking you're special. You pretend you don't care about recognition, so no one can use it against you. Over time, you start believing this act is your true nature. But all this pretending doesn't serve you. It doesn't serve the people around you. When you act small, you don't inspire anyone. You just reinforce the idea that no one should be too proud, too confident, too free. You can see this pattern everywhere. In workplaces where people preface every idea with disclaimers. This might be stupid, but in friendships where no one celebrates their wins out loud because they don't want to seem like they're bragging. In families where success must be hidden or softened so no one feels threatened. This isn't humility. It's collective insecurity. It's the fear of standing out, masquerading as virtue. True humility doesn't require you to act powerless. It doesn't mean denying your strengths or refusing to honor your achievements. Real humility is the ability to see your gifts clearly without needing to inflate them or disguise them. It's knowing your worth, and understanding it doesn't make you superior or inferior to anyone else. But when you're stuck in the humility performance loop, you can't access that balance. You're too busy managing how others perceive you. You shrink yourself to avoid judgment, and in doing so, you betray the part of you that longs to be seen fully. Imagine how different your life would feel if you stopped performing. If you allowed yourself to acknowledge your talent, your effort, your growth without apology. If you could say, yes, I did this. Yes, I'm proud. Yes, I deserve this moment. That's not arrogance. That's honesty. It's easy to tell yourself you're being humble when you're really hiding. It's easy to believe you're protecting others from your success when you're really protecting yourself from vulnerability. Because there is nothing more vulnerable than being visible, standing in your power without the shield of false modesty. Think about the people you admire most. Are they the ones who constantly diminish themselves? Or are they the ones who own their gifts while staying grounded? Chances are, you respect those who are both confident and kind, who can share their achievements without making others feel small. That is real humility, confidence without superiority. You don't have to keep performing smallness. You don't have to keep rehearsing insecurity in the costume of virtue. You can be proud of what you've built. You can celebrate your progress without disclaimers. You can let yourself be seen in all your complexity, your flaws and your strengths together. Because the world doesn't need more people pretending to be less than they are. It needs people willing to stand in their light without fear. People who understand that owning your power doesn't diminish anyone else. It expands what's possible. The next time you feel the urge to downplay yourself, pause. Ask where that instinct comes from. Is it true humility or old fear? Is it kindness or habit? What would it feel like to tell the truth about who you are without shrinking, without apology? That truth is your birthright, and it is the only thing that will ever set you free. Truth is final destination. We grow up believing that truth is a place we can arrive at if we just try hard enough. Like there's a final answer waiting at the end of all our searching, a perfect clarity that will finally make sense of everything. We chase it like a mountaintop, thinking that if we can only reach the summit, we will never have to question again. But truth isn't an endpoint. It isn't a monument. It's a shifting mirror. Every time you look into it, it shows you something a little different. Because you are different, the world is different, and understanding evolves whether you want it to or not. Think about the beliefs you held with certainty 5 or 10 years ago. The convictions that felt unbreakable. Maybe it was an idea about who you were meant to be, about what love is, about how the world works. At the time, those beliefs felt like the final word. But when you look back now, you see all the cracks. You see the moments you ignored evidence because it didn't fit your story. You see how much you were still learning, even when you thought you had arrived. That's what truth does. It expands the second you try to capture it. The idea that truth is static is comforting. It promises control. If you can find the answer once, you never have to doubt again. But life doesn't work that way. New experiences, new perspectives, new evidence, they all conspire to remind you that your understanding is provisional. Even scientific truths evolve. What was accepted fact a century ago now sounds absurd, not because people were foolish, but because they worked with the tools and information they had. And we are doing the same today. Our truths feel complete only because we haven't seen what tomorrow will reveal. Look at your relationships. How many times have you believed you finally understood someone? You told yourself, this is who they are. And maybe you were right for a moment. But people change. Context changes. What you knew became outdated, and your certainty turned into limitation. The truth about someone is never a single story. It's a mosaic of shifting pieces. The moment you decide you've seen the whole picture is the moment you stop seeing clearly. Even your understanding of yourself is fluid. You think you know your limits, your desires, your purpose. But wait long enough, and life will surprise you. You will outgrow old definitions. You will discover parts of yourself you couldn't have imagined. That doesn't mean you were wrong before. It means you were incomplete, and you still are. The danger is not in being unfinished. The danger is in pretending you're not. The search for final truth is often just an escape from uncertainty. We don't want to live in the discomfort of not knowing. We crave the relief of conclusion. But that craving makes us vulnerable to illusions. We latch on to simple answers because they feel safer than the complexity of reality. We declare something true because we are too tired to keep asking questions. But comfort isn't the same as clarity. Consider the big questions about meaning, morality, existence itself. We keep hoping for a definitive answer, one that will silence all doubt. But maybe the point isn't to silence doubt. Maybe the point is to learn to live with it, to see it as a companion instead of an enemy. Doubt is what keeps you humble. It's what keeps you curious. When you abandon the illusion of finality, you make space for growth. This doesn't mean truth doesn't matter. It matters immensely. But it matters because it guides us, not because it ends the journey. Think of it like a compass, not a destination. It points you in a direction, but it doesn't promise you've arrived. Every time you learn something new, the compass recalibrates. Every time you discover a blind spot, the needle moves. If you insist on clinging to the old direction, you'll end up lost while telling yourself you're still on the right path. This is why intellectual humility is so powerful. It's not the absence of conviction. It's the presence of openness. It's the willingness to say, this is what I believe now, based on what I know. But I am ready to revise when new evidence appears. That mindset is rare because it requires surrendering the fantasy of certainty. It requires admitting that no matter how much you've studied, how much you've experienced, how much you've suffered, your understanding is still partial. Ask yourself, what truths do you cling to because you're afraid of what happens if they crumble? What beliefs feel so essential that you can't imagine questioning them? Those are the places where you're most likely to mistake comfort for reality. Those are the places where your search has quietly ended without your consent. The next time you feel the relief of having found the answer, pause. Ask yourself if you've really reached the end, or if you've simply decided to stop looking. Remember that truth doesn't stay whole when you shine a new light on it. It fractures, it refracts, and in those broken pieces you find a deeper understanding. Not because you've arrived, but because you've accepted that arrival is an illusion. Truth isn't a mountaintop you conquer. It's a shifting mirror you learn to face. And, in its reflections, however incomplete, you discover not just what the world is, but who you are becoming.